How do I? Oh, I have your attention. We'll start in like 1 minute, so I'll let you get to your seats. Right. So, good afternoon. My name is Susan Branson. I serve as the Executive Director for the California Transportation Commission. On behalf of the Commission, I would like to welcome everyone who is here today in person and those of you who are on the webcast. I would like to begin by acknowledging the commissioners, the California Transportation Commissioners, who have joined us here today. And we have Chair Alvarado, Bob Alvarado, Vice Chair Fran Inman, and we have Commissioner Chris Kehoe. So I just want to thank you, the three of you, for attending this event today. So housekeeping issues, just right off the gate, I want to let you know that we do have some sign-in sheets. If you wouldn't mind signing in, we would greatly appreciate that. There are restrooms out the door around the corner, and there are emergency exits here in this room on each side. So the purpose of this meeting today is to initiate and provide an overview of the process that we are embarking on to update the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines and to develop guidelines for the California Transportation Plan. We are fortunate today to have a number of distinguished presenters that will provide a unique perspective on the most important attributes in these guidelines that should be either amended into the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines or be included in the first set of guidelines for the California Transportation Plan. But before we start hearing from the moderators and panelists, I wanted to provide just a brief background on regional transportation plans and the California Transportation Plan. The Regional Transportation Plan identifies a 20-year vision for transportation priorities and investments. It does identify the projects from a California Transportation Commission perspective. It does set forth the projects that later become funded in California State Transportation Improvement Program, the California State Highway Operation Protection Program, and other programs under the Commission's purview. So these plans are very important to the Commission and to the regions and to the state. There are both federal and state requirements that prescribe what needs to be included in regional transportation plans. These have been in law since the early 70s, and there's been changes in statute over the years. The most significant recent state statutory requirement that impacted the RTP process was the passage of SB 375 in 2008. The California Transportation Plan is a 20-year planning document that's prepared by Caltrans every 5 years. There are both federal and state requirements that govern the development of the California Transportation Plan. Again, these statutes have also been in law since the early 70s. The most significant recent state statutory requirement that has impacted the CTP process has been with the passage of Senate Bill 391 in 2009. This legislation requires that Caltrans identify the statewide multimodal transportation system needed to achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 over 1990 levels. The most current plan, CTP 2040, was just approved this week, and it is posted on Caltrans' website. The Commission is statutorily authorized to adopt guidelines to inform both the development of the regional transportation plans and the California Transportation Plan. The Commission is required to consult with the Air Resources Board on the development of modeling guidance used to prepare the Regional Transportation Plan, and the Commission is also required to consult with Caltrans in the development of guidelines for the California Transportation Plan. The guidelines for these plans are intended to promote an integrated multimodal transportation planning process leading to effective transportation investments and to set forth a uniform transportation planning framework. This guidance is used to identify federal and state laws and regulations, requirements, but it also will identify and incorporate recommendations that are identified by practitioners and stakeholders which represent good planning practice. And that's, much of the effort that we are requesting your assistance and participation on today and moving forward. The guidelines, however, do not carry the weight of regulation. So the RTP guidelines were first adopted by the Commission in 1978, and over the years they have been amended. The most recent amendment was in 2010. The guidelines were amended to reflect guidance necessary with the passage of Senate Bill 375. Up until now, the California Transportation Commission has not had a statutory role in adopting guidelines for the California Transportation Plan. In 2014, Senate Bill 486 authorized the Commission to establish guidelines for the California Transportation Plan. And so these guidelines that we're embarking on developing, once they're adopted by the Commission, will provide general direction to Caltrans as they work on the development of the CTP, the California Transportation Plan 2045. This plan is statutorily required to be adopted by December 31st, 2020. So just for clarification, we're embarking on two sets of guidelines. One to inform the RTP development process, the other to inform the CTP development process. While these are parallel processes, we see that they interrelate to one another, and there's value to developing these guidelines in parallel. So today we have 4 panels. The purpose of these panels is to provide perspectives from transportation leaders on the important considerations that should be addressed in both the California Transportation Plan and the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines. If time allows, we have built in approximately 10 minutes after each panel for questions. For the individuals here in the room who have questions, we will have a microphone. Laura Pennybaker is here with a mic. And for those of you viewing the webcast, we have a email that we will be putting up on the screen here where you can send any questions you have to Doug Remedios. For those questions that we're unable to respond to given our time limitations, if you send them via email, we will respond to you. So with that, I would like to first thank the panelists who are here today and those of you who are going to speak later, and our moderators. And I would like to also welcome Commissioner Lucy Dunn, who is, thank you for being here today. So I will turn it over to Comey Ajisi. He serves as the Chief Deputy Director for California Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Susan. I think it's appropriate to applaud the opening. You're all silent. Get some. Come on, people. You did some work there. Thank you, Susan, for the opening. And also thank you and the Commission for hosting this discussions today on both the CTP and RTP guidelines. I also want to thank all of you in the audience. I think one of the things that we know about transportation is our stakeholdership is always very strong and very consistent, and you all are demonstrating that today. I am privileged to moderate a very august panel, and I think I can go on the record and say this is probably the most distinguished panel I've been privileged to. I'm going to have to write home and tell somebody because this is a really distinguished panel. And I'm hoping that we get out of them some conversation that sets the tone for the directions that we are taking in this state particularly. I think you would appreciate from the panel that it's diverse and different than we used to have, the conversations we used to have in transportation. So on the panel, real quickly, we have Tasha Clements. Tasha is from the Division Office of the Federal Highways, Director on Project Delivery. Program delivery. I always get that wrong. Program delivery. We have Mr. Joe Myers. Mr. Myers is the chair of the Native American Advisory Committee, the Caltrans chair, Native American Advisory Committee, and he's also from the Indian Justice Center out of the Bay Area. It's always good to have Joe around. And I have a guy named Malcolm Doherty. I never met the man before. He's a director of transportation. Malcolm is the director of Caltrans. still signs my paycheck, so I got to be careful. We also have Mr. Ken Alex. Mr. Alex is the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and they have jurisdiction over a lot of the planning activities that we do statewide, and he's going to speak to that. Sitting in, before I get to Linda, we have Richard Corey with us. Mr. Corey is the Executive Officer of the California Area Resources Board. It's good to see you, Richard. And sitting for the Director of the Department of Housing and Community Development is Linda Whitten. Linda is an Assistant Director with the Department of Housing and Community Development. And lastly, we have, and not the least, we have Dr. Karen Smith. And Dr. Smith is the Director of the Department of Public Health. And it's good to have that dimension added to our conversation today. So what I think we're going to do, what I would like to do real quickly is give the panelists a chance to go through. We're going to go through all of the panelists, give them about 2 to 3 minutes to give us a sense of, from their perspective, from your various perch and perspective, how you view this particular discussion today on the guidelines, and especially what the import of the RTP is and the CTP is to the discussions and to the development and the future of the state, given all of the things that you've come to understand are relevant to transportation. It's a very broad opening that I'm trying to give you, but hopefully allows us to understand your perspective and where you come into this conversation. And so with that, I thought I would start with Malcolm. Given that you are the Director of Transportation, and it does say so in law, by the way, I thought maybe we'll start with, from your perspective, given the work that the department has done on its strategic plan, and from your understanding of what all else is going on, if you would talk to why these are important times and important conversations to have about the CTP and the RTP guidelines.
Well, thanks, Kome. It's a pleasure to be here, and let me also echo the appreciation that both Susan and Kome offered up to the fellow panel members, but also I want to take the opportunity to also thank Susan Branson and the CTC and their staff, as well as our staff, that would be putting all the work into outreach and engagement with all the transportation stakeholders, but all other stakeholders that have a connection to transportation. I think that's going to be an important step as we go forward. Update the guidelines for the regional transportation plan, and then also develop the guidelines for the California transportation plan. And as was noted earlier, the CTP 2040 just came out this week on Tuesday. And I guarantee you on Wednesday, some staff already started thinking about the CTP 2045. So the opportunity to talk about guidelines and update guidelines for the RTPs now is the perfect opportunity to make sure that there's some consistency between those plans and compatibility between the goals and objectives in both those plans. I think the CTP, the California Transportation Plan, it's going to have an opportunity to speak directly to interregional travel, and regional transportation plans are going to have the opportunity to speak directly to regional, and the compatibility between all of those plans is going to be paramount, and it's got to be a multimodal plan such that there's interconnectivity. And I think that's really the most important opportunity that we need to take advantage of when we do this outreach effort. And again, my appreciation to the CTC in embarking on that today. I think this is the perfect way to start that effort off by doing a workshop, public workshop. The other thing that I want to make sure that I talk about is the interconnectivity of all the objectives. You have a broad spectrum of interest represented up here on the panel, and they're all connected. And the objectives of a transportation plan should not be limited to just improving mobility. It certainly should entail improving multimodal mobility and all modes, but it also has to overlay that with environmental and air quality interests, economic prosperity interests, quality of life interests. We need to take all of those objectives into context when we're developing a transportation plan, and I think that's the opportunity, the second opportunity that I think is really important. So consistency, compatibility, and then also a multi-objective accomplishment of the transportation plan. And as was articulated by Susan earlier, there are air quality goals that are set out and are mandated to be included in a California transportation plan so that we develop that plan and have a guidance to be able to achieve that sustainable transportation system in the future. And it's got to start to articulate that. So I can't underscore any more than was already done. I can just add to it the importance of collaboration and engaging all stakeholders, not just transportation stakeholders, but all stakeholders. And I'm very appreciative not only to the CTC staff, but also the Caltrans staff that will be playing an important role in the lift to try to update those guidelines and take that input. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the engagement not only with panel members but also the audience.
So if I can ask Joe to maybe take us in coming at a very, very different direction as to the importance of this particular effort as far as the Native American community is concerned and your perspective on transportation in general between the parties, especially involving Native American tribes. I think there's a button to push. There you go.
Thank you, Comey, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and say a few words about the role of tribal governments in transportation planning process in California. And I think the role of tribal governments has been enhanced by Caltrans and the advisory committee that meets on a quarterly basis and with tribal leaders to go over the issues that concern them with regard to the intergovernmental relationship between the state of California and the tribal leaders throughout the state, as well as talking about the government-to-government basis between the federally recognized tribes here in California, of which there are 110, and the federal government. So there is this existing relationship that has been developed and recognized over the years between federally recognized tribes and the federal government. And in California, at least, we have that recognition going beyond the federal acknowledgement to the state acknowledgement. And I think Caltrans has done a stellar job in coming up with a system that probes the interests of tribes statewide in California with this advisory committee. And so we have the government-to-government relationship between the federal government and federally recognized tribes, as well as the government-to-government relationship between the state of California through Caltrans and the federally recognized tribes. I think that if we look at regional guidelines for the state of California in terms of who we reach out to for guidance in the regional context. We cannot leave out, if you will, the attention that needs to be paid to the role of tribal governments in the various regions throughout the state. So I think we're on a good footing. I also would like to commend Malcolm for his participation in seeing that the regional, the quarterly meetings, which he attends on a regular basis with the advisory committee. It gives the committee a sound footing on recognizing that the executives of Caltrans look very importantly on the idea of including tribal perspectives in transportation issues that affect tribes in California, both on and off the reservations. No matter how you look at it, the population and the interests of California citizens seem to creep into Indian country quite continuously, and so there really needs to be a good relationship that the tribes and the state agencies can strike with each other.
Thank you, Joe. I'm just going to note for your interest that there's a certain person here, Jose, is going to be harassing you with signs, so just don't mind him. Which means you're going to pay attention to him now.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to go to Tasha next. So from the federal perspective, the state transportation plan and the regional transportation plans are requirements under federal law. What do you guys want?
That's not an easy question. But what I would like to say, first of all, this is my week 5 being in the state, and because I come from my headquarters office in Washington, D.C., where I worked on rulemaking. And from the federal side, especially on the local level, that is actually us working with our partners on what we are talking about, this performance measures and target setting. It's going to be very important for us to coordinate with all of our partners to make sure that we meet the deadlines that was actually included in MAP 21, was passed through the FAST Act, and is also part of our planning rule. We have to make sure that as we are working on the RTP, that the requirements that are stated in the planning rule are actually included. For instance, there has to be a discussion in the RTP that talks about the performance measures as well as the performance targets for improving the performance on our transportation system. And the only way that we can get to that and developing those targets is through this coordination piece, and we have to make sure that we're reaching out to our partners. We do have in section 45208, it talks about that the state DOT shall coordinate, the MPOs shall coordinate when coming to the table to discuss the performance targets, and that includes our local partners as well as our tribal partners. So the expectation from the federal perspective is that we take the initiative to continue to work together to achieve those performance targets. There are some deadlines that's actually been included in our performance rule, and that is the state DOTs have 1 year to have those targets in place at the time that the performance rules are effective. The performance rule for planning was released on May the 27th and was effective on June the 27th. And so after that 1 year deadline, our MPOs are required to have their targets in place 180 days. So from the federal perspective, we have not received a mandate where we can say what the targets are, but we really would like to be at the table with our state partners and the MPOs to participate in those conversations as to what would be appropriate for California, the whole state. So from a federal perspective, that is something that we are going to be working closely with Caltrans and our MPOs on, and that is having those targets in place so that we can have something that meets the deadline for our national partners to be able to report back to Congress.
Thanks, Tasha. I'm going to go to Mr. Alex next. Ken, so the feds have their requirements. Obviously, the state's got its policy priorities as well. How do you see that, all those meshing together in this conversation?
Well, thank you, Kome and Susan and commissioners, and thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. I actually wear 3 hats in the Brown administration, probably because the governor doesn't want to pay more than one salary, but I'm the director of the Office of Planning and Research, the chair of the Strategic Growth Council, and senior policy advisor to the governor. All of these are relevant to the planning process that we're talking about today. And I think you've already heard some common themes, and I'm going to echo them. The importance of cooperation And the fact that this transportation planning process is not simply about transportation, but it is really key to what the state of California looks like in the year 2045, and between now and then, the actions we need to take to get there. So how do we preserve farmland and open space? What do development patterns look like? How do we ensure that our residents have access to transportation options, multimodal activities? Very significantly, how do we reduce GHG emissions? And how do we ensure that our transportation system are resilient, particularly in the light of climate change? So all of these are implicated by both the California Transportation Plan and the Regional Transportation Plan. So we are quite interested in ensuring that the guidance that is presented captures the inclusiveness of these sets of challenges. The overlap between what the Strategic Growth Council does and OPR and some of the governor's executive orders around these issues is very substantial, which is great. I think there's a substantial recognition of that at Caltrans, at the Transportation Agency and the CTC, and our various staffs work closely together. And you know, let me mention the priorities in this area of the administration. Reducing GHG emissions. The governor has signed multiple executive orders around this. We have a 40% reduction target from 1990 levels by 2030, and then going out a little beyond 2045 to 2050, we have an 80% reduction target. The transportation sector represents about 40% of emissions in the state of California. When you add in development patterns that are impacted by transportation systems, the impact and emission levels are even higher. We need to think about the implications of the transportation system for disadvantaged communities, for health outcomes, as I'm sure we'll hear more about in a minute, for complete streets and multimodal access. How do we change our evaluation from what we've done historically around level of service and traffic delay to one oriented more towards vehicle miles traveled, which is where the state is heading under legislation and guidance that my office has been working on in conjunction with Caltrans. Also, we should make very clear mention of the metropolitan planning organizations that many of us here work with very closely on an ongoing basis. We don't want to leave them to their own devices. It's an important partnership. The regional transportation plans need to sync up with the California plans. There are obligations under the law that the regional plans and the sustainable community strategies, which have a very substantial overlap with those plans, those all need to sync up, and they need to meet pretty specific legal requirements, and I'm sure Richard will talk a little bit about that in a second. So to close up, the overlap is very substantial. It implicates many of the things that we're working on as an administration, and I really am pleased that the commission today is opening up this public process and gathering information to move into the guidance phase. Thanks, Comey.
Thanks, Ken. So, Richard, Ken called you out a little bit. What's your perspective on this with regards to the RTP guidelines, CTP guidelines, and where the RB comes into play?
Yes, thank you, Comey. And it really is a pleasure to be here as part of this discussion. I think the work on the guidelines is critically important. And if I think about and don't think of my points as duplicating, I'm reinforcing a few points here. But one of them is priorities, state priorities in terms of cleaner energy, environmental priorities, and transportation. These aren't independent priorities. They are directly interwoven and interconnected and require comprehensive coordinated planning. And if I call out three numbers, 40, 80, and 95, this is a Jeopardy question, and ask you what they represent. They represent the percent of GHG emissions, NOx emissions, and diesel particulate emissions associated with the transportation sector in California. In additional numbers, the GHG reduction target that Ken called out, a 2030 reduction target relative to our 2020 target of 40%, a 40% reduction from 2020, an 80% reduction by 2050. With respect to achieving our health-based ozone standards, we need about an 80% reduction of NOx in Southern California from today's levels, 80%. And I say all this because of the opportunity that we have in front of us with respect to the transportation system. Transportation system is going to change. It's changing now. It's evolving. It's an organism. It's multiple systems. And it is going to change. To me, the question on the table is how do we want it to change? And how can we influence and guide it so it changes in a way that meets the best interest of the state and Californians? And I think that's the opportunity, and that's also clearly the challenge in front of us going forward. But there's no doubt in my mind that the path forward is going to be build on at a level I think that is unprecedented in terms of the level of collaboration and coordination. We certainly have coordinated with one another historically on plans, but I think what is going to be called for, both the state, locals, where much of the action happens, as well as a broad spectrum of stakeholders, is going to require levels of coordination we haven't visited before. We're going to need to do that. We need creative financing. We need investments in infrastructure that advance what I'm talking about, in technologies and fuels, public-private partnerships. So it's an exciting time, a challenging one in terms of how we get there, but what I know won't do it is working in independent silos. So this process, we're pleased with it, we're encouraged by it, and look really forward to participating as the guidelines move forward.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to Dr. Smith. So Linda has been part of this discussion for a long time, right, Linda? But Dr. Smith is relatively new to this conversation, and I just was wondering how you see public health being a stakeholder in this. I'm sure you do, but if you would speak to that.
I do. What a surprise. So my responsibility as the state public health officer is to protect the health of Californians, but it actually goes further than that, because what we know is that the way we live, where we live, and what's available to us in the way that we live has the most profound effect actually on health, far more so than whether you have access to medical care. And transportation is a disproportionately important one of these, what we call social determinants of health, because it provides the link that takes people to and provides them access to the other critical things that they need: food, jobs, housing, and the medical services that they need, schools, et cetera. In addition to that, another really important public health issue into the future is climate change. So, usually public health is that field that's telling you don't eat donuts, don't eat meat, don't do this, that, or the other thing. I used to call us the field of don't. But at this point, we're in the enviable position of being able to say virtually every single intervention that government puts in place to try to increase sustainability, decrease greenhouse gases, actually turns out to be really positive for human health. And what's so important about the process that we're engaging on here is if we can build in a recognition of potential both positive and negative health outcomes to the way we plan around transportation, it will have ripple effects for all the reasons that we've just heard. It also impacts how we develop in general. And we can actually, these are things that we can actually measure. So they do provide actual concrete targets that can be approached that are a little bit different than particulate matter, but really move one step further and say, what are the health outcomes cumulatively of that kind of process. And it also gives us an opportunity to build in an agenda that advances equity as well. And Mr. Alex mentioned our vulnerable communities. These are communities that public health, particularly at the local level, has been working in for generations. And one of the things that we have to offer is a long experience working with those communities and knowing how to bring them to a conversation in a way that they trust. And so I'm very excited that we have the opportunity to really actively participate. We do already work. The Health in All Policies Task Force has been very active in planning and working with the governor's office on general plan guidelines, for example, that the guidelines that you create, the RTP guidelines, are going to then be magnified dramatically as they're put into effect at the regional level. And that is a conversation that we're very excited to be able to help with.
Thank you. So, Linda, we've had this long conversation about jobs, housing balance. That's always been a staple topic of conversation in transportation. What's your department's perspective coming from all of those discussions and looking out from here? What's your perspective on what this guidelines should be pushing in terms of housing?
Well, first of all, I'm standing in today for Ben Metcalf, our HCD's new director, who sends his regrets, but is certainly a collaborator in all of these issues. He comes to us from HUD, working, for example, with the Federal Partnership for Sustainable Communities and a lot of the related efforts, and have dived right in. I would say that the most important role that both the CTP and the RTP guidelines serve is to push the envelope. I've had the opportunity to work on the actual development of several different, everything from the freight plan to the last round of RTP guidelines in a number of areas. And I think we've incrementally done this, but our challenges grow ever bigger. I would argue that probably our biggest cross-cutting challenge across all of our sectors is inequality. We have a very serious economic inequality that affects everything from public health to certainly our land use development patterns. And we have made some progress. I remember it's probably perhaps even less than 15 years ago, when we were working with Caltrans on regional blueprints funded with the federal money, and our federal partners were going, that's housing. I don't think this activity would be eligible for this money. But we evolved from that perspective to actually winning an award from the FHWA for our integration and our collaboration on integrating housing and transportation. And of course, we went on from there and evolved from regional blueprints to sustainable communities strategies. And jobs housing balance went from long being a planning principle to being concerned about jobs housing fit. And improving the sophistication of our modeling. And so today, we're all across sectors, we're dealing with issues like displacement, gentrification and displacement, and certainly connectivity and supporting active transportation. Those are, and housing at all levels of the spectrum plays an important role in that. It plays an important role in the feasibility and our ability to support mode shift. In the freight plan, it's important that we come up with strategies to impact and improve public health. There are no end of ways in which our fields are intertwined, and we have increasingly been working in a collaborative manner to do so. So I would encourage the commissioners to, as we go through this process, engage broadly and push us.
Thank you. So we've had a chance to go through the panel one time. I think I'm just going to throw out one question and see how you'll react to it, and maybe you can jump at the question depending on how eager you feel. And I think one of the things that I think came through from the panel's presentation is there's a lot of moving parts to this conversation, more so than we've ever had before. I heard many times the talk about equity. There's talk about air quality and emissions, especially greenhouse gases. There's talk about, I don't know that we talked about technology, but that's obviously something to consider. And so there are all of these multiple issues that we're bringing to bear on just little transportation. So my question to you is, how do we make all of this fit? And what's the imperative? Where do you begin to make the priority cut? Because ultimately, transportation needs to serve transportation. And I'm positing this question so that you'll come at it from your perspective and say, what else does it mean? Because I think you've defined transportation in a very broad way, and I think it's become an accepted perspective that transportation is a little bit more. I think Dr. Smith talked about an important determinant of well-being. Because of that, it's got all of these elements added to it. How do we, in terms of the meager resources we have, how do we make this fit as we go forward and be practical about it?
Well, man, if that's not the $64,000 question. I think that's what this whole effort really wants to try to accomplish, is how are we going to do that moving forward. Transportation has huge implications across all the other decisions we make on all these other subjects. Likewise, all the decisions we make on these other subjects drives the demand and the type of demand. And I think that land use question is going to be a big one because it creates demand. What kind of demand are we going to drive? Are we going to drive or instigate, I shouldn't use the word drive. Are we going to instigate demand that relies on driving? Are we going to instigate demand that can rely more on transit or walking or biking? Because we're responding as transportation professionals to the demand that's put in front of us. So that's where those land use policies. And then once you have good policies and you try to address that demand in the most appropriate way, it has implications across the health spectrum, the affordable housing spectrum, and all those other things. So it's all intertwined, and it's no easy answer. But I think having good guidance for the regional plans and the California transportation can really be a good platform to build off of, and hope that that's consistent with the other objectives that are within the administration, and generally speaking, good for California.
Okay.
So I would say that transportation is not an end in itself, that it is part of how we think about things like equity and health impacts and access and opportunity. And so I think it is essential that we think about transportation and transportation planning in the context of many of the goals that you just heard about, and that they're iterative, that as we think about, so one of the things we're doing under AB 32 and thinking about the scoping plan and how California meets its greenhouse gas emissions is, what are the emissions associated with land use in the transportation sector? Well, it turns out that they affect each other. So decisions that we make about transportation impact the emissions that result from land use. Decisions that we make about land use impact the transportation sector. So we have to think about this really in quite a holistic way as we integrate our transportation goals with those of the state overall.
Dr. Smith?
So from my perspective, with something this complicated, it helps to start with what's the state where you want to end. And the better you describe what that end state looks like, and it's not what does the transportation system look like, it's what is it that we want the California to look like, and work back from that. It helps you to provide a check as you're planning. Does this achieve those things that we said we wanted to get to? Does it help advance equity? Does it provide housing that's close to jobs? Because from my perspective, that actually turns out to be really important to human health, that kind of thing. And that way you are, as Mr. Alex just said, you're not talking about what's the perfect transportation system, but what's the transportation system serving in terms of where you want to go overall as California, where we want to go as Californians.
I think from the planning, from the federal side, it includes everything that has just been mentioned, and that is that collaboration. We have to understand what's important for our area. I mean, our state DOTs and MPOs receive planning dollars, and those planning dollars go towards good planning. Well, part of good planning is understanding what the needs are. in that particular area. And I think from the federal side, what we are going to continue to emphasize is coordination and collaboration with all of our partners to make sure that we have a concise planning document and process in place.
So the good old 3 Cs still makes sense today.
Still strong.
So I'm gonna call in the commissioners in a bit to see if they have any questions. I imagine you probably have questions, so I'm going to let you all speak in a minute. But you wanted to add something, Linda?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think public engagement and getting broader public buy-in of our challenges is increasingly important. We're seeing, it's hard to pass sales tax measures. And just getting the public to understand that we're doing more than one thing when we are coming up with revenue sources. So I think we have to work harder and harder to help facilitate public engagement and consensus on these issues.
So before I ask the commissioners for whether they have questions, I'm going to ask Joe. You talked about the fact that we're doing incredible work with Native American communities in California. I imagine it's not perfect. How can we expand that conversation? How can we expand, I think Linda just talked about public engagement. How can we expand the engagement with the Native American community? Because most people don't really understand government to government and consultation. I wonder if you can shed some light on that.
Well, I think that
It's on.
Is it on? I think we need to look at the involvement of tribal governments as partners, not stakeholders, but partners in trying to achieve a situation where everyone has a seat at the planning table. And I think historically, tribal governments were not invited to the planning table. And that has to change. And I think it's changing to a degree in California, but we're not there yet. But I think the idea of looking at tribal involvement, tribal government involvement as partners at the table is an important distinction. And we're moving in that direction. I just don't think we're there yet.
Okay. Chair Alvarado.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you for everybody for participating today. And I think as we go through all the different panels and then start working to put these regional transportation plans and everything together, I think that we all need to be aware that, we each have our own constituencies. We each have our own agendas. But, we need to understand that it can't be an all or nothing proposal. As you move forward in the process, there's going to be some give and take, and I think the more of the give and take is going to make a better document. We can't just stand back and grab for what we want, and if we don't get everything we got, it's a failure because we've been very successful these last 3 or 4 big meetings that we've had like this on everything from the mileage fee to the last RTPs and that came forward to the commission. Have been very, very successful. So I think that has to be the number one goal of everybody in the room, every participant, whether you're a partner, a stakeholder, or an office holder, is to make this just a very successful document that we can rely on for years to come.
Thanks, Comey. I think one thing that's unfortunately missing from our discussion today, and we tried not to have this happen, but our economic development discussion is that seat's empty. And I think that's sad for all of us because as Dr. Smith talked about the jobs housing balance, the economic development portion of that
is so important. As my fellow commissioner, Lucy Dunn's like to say, the houses are where jobs go to sleep at night. And so I think it is important. And as Linda talked, you know, we've all been sitting around the table. We used to have business, transportation, and housing all in one agency. So we've been having some of these conversations, but I think the more we can all get as many different voices, and Comey and I share a favorite Nigerian author, but she has a great piece that talks about the danger of a single story, and I think that's what Chair Alvarado was talking about, that we have to beware of a single story and really look at where do we find the common ground, how do we all move forward together. So to the extent that, you know, we need to be dynamic. We do operate on the system of systems in the transportation world. And I think for all of us, I think also our next panel with our MPO partners are huge. Most of our state, it's about 75% of our self-help dollars that are really our transportation engines, so to speak. So I think working collaboratively, our MPOs and our sales tax initiatives have been a very successful model for all of us. I shudder to think where we would be in the transportation world if we hadn't helped ourselves. But whether it's our Native American partners, we're all in this together, and I think that we have to really make sure that we continue to move forward. But it really, you know, the health risk of poverty is something that we worry about as well.
So you raise a good point, and I wonder if some of the panelists will respond to the role of the economy in this conversation, because it's. I think we can talk about what the needs are in terms of the various multilateral issues that we're dealing with and trying to solve as a community in California. But then one of those elements of the multilateral needs is to continue to make sure that California is competitive, both on the national and the global scale. How does that fit into the perspectives that you bring to making sure that we broaden the conversation on transportation planning?
Well, from my perspective, I listed a whole host of, not all-inclusive, but a whole host of objectives that we need to try to account for, and many of them were reiterated by others. But driving a positive economy absolutely has to be part of one of those objectives. And if I recall the executive order, it talked about increasing our competitiveness in the state. And again, it's a balance, but I think we need to make sure that we're driving to accomplish all of these goals while increasing access and increasing quality of life and a positive economy. It's got to be one of the objectives that we're striving to achieve.
It's definitely an element of sustainability, is that we can economically sustain what we're trying to do.
So that's exactly what I was going to say, and it's also a rather central issue right now in terms of infrastructure and our investment in infrastructure, which we hope to see in greater supply.
So I want to make sure we have some time for questions. I don't see any. Okay, there are a number of people with questions there, but I think Commissioner Akio might have a question.
Thank you, Comey. I wanted to thank the Commission for putting this panel together. This lightning round discussion was terrific. For a new commissioner to hear you all go down your priorities and linking them to transportation was, a little 101 class for me. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. There were some important topics and themes that came up over and over again. I think we all get that. Our challenge will be to make sure that these guidelines are produced in a timely way so they're usable around the state by our regional agencies, because that's the way California will align statewide on these important priorities. And our challenge will be, of course, taking this high-level thinking that is so interesting and stimulating to hear and applying it to a document that can work from San Ysidro to whatever is way up north, beyond Eureka, speaking as a San Diegan. So we need to do a timely but thorough job, and I would just say we are always on guard. We are always thinking about the next big thing, but my fellow Commissioner Lucy Dunn says we should celebrate our victories, and I think the California economy is the envy of the world. It's one of our greatest success stories. So our challenge is to keep it moving and to keep it sustainable at the same time.
Thank you. Commissioner Dunn?
Thanks, Comey. Again, let me echo congratulations and thanks to all of you for your time and participation today. I want to just reiterate the fact, commented on so many different ways in all of your distinct disciplines on the need for innovation, a new technology. Recognize we're in a sharing economy that is creating new social solutions to economic problems that government sometimes has not been very good at solving. And so I would ask, as you look at these things, take a look at those solutions that government can be helpful with, but not get in the way of either. And I think that's a really important dynamic to think about in a market share as huge as California, where we're seeing solutions come up today that have been in place for 10 years and government is now just saying, well, maybe we should start regulating them. So think in terms of that kind of new innovative economy and what we can do to incentivize some of the solutions that help every one of your disciplines interact better with each other. So I'm asking for your thinking, and especially all of us out here, in terms of flexibility and incentives. And the last thing to share is there are things that you are all so smart, so thoughtful at with regard to climate change, interconnectiveness, interdisciplinary approaches. But there are things that we think of up here in Sacramento that sometimes are counterintuitive to our public. And they don't have the tools to understand what you're trying to do. For all of our climate change goals, I dare say that the homemaker that's sitting in a 2-hour commute from the Inland Empire to her job and then trying to get home to make her Girl Scout meeting, she's less concerned about climate change than how come that road isn't moving. And so to make the climate change goals real and effective for the average person, we need to be thinking about how we explain how it impacts their real life, how it helps them with their real life. I love what you said, Doctor, that there are things that we're doing in climate change that actually can help someone's health and they don't even realize it. So I would be in thinking of on our guidelines, and it might be an add-on. What are the tools that we're giving to our public that might otherwise be counterintuitive to them in the approaches we're all taking as state leaders? So thank you very much for your comments.
So we're going to go to questions. I have about 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm David Schoenbrunner with Transnet. This question or comment is for Mr. Alex. There's a huge problem with the batch of sales tax measures going to the ballot this fall. They are stuck in the past. Sales taxes account for more than half the transportation funding in our region, but there's no correspondence between the new expenditure plans and the SCS or CTP 2040. These plans will lead to a big growth in VMT, contrary to state policy. We have letters that actually say, from CMAs, that say we have no responsibility to reduce VMT or GHG. That's the responsibility of the MPO. What's needed is a statutory requirement that CMA plans be consistent with the goals of the current RTP and SCS.
Could you ask the question, because we have about less than 5 minutes left?
I'm identifying a need for legislation. MPOs will not be able to accomplish their regional GHG emissions target if the county plans remain stuck in the past. Thank you.
So
Yeah,
very
okay.
quick comment
Real quick comment,
in
thank you.
response. As you'll probably hear in the next panel from the MPOs, the SCAG region tax proposal on the ballot identifies that 96% of expenditures are non-highway expenditures. So they are working to have those expenditures be consistent with their SCS. And in addition, there is a lot of work to try to ensure that county and local jurisdictions operate consistently with the SCSs, but there's more to be done.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please make your questions very
Yes,
concise,
thank
if you don't mind.
Good afternoon. I'm Richard Marcantonio with Public Advocates, and I have a question for you, Ms. Clemens. Secretary Fox recently joined two other federal agencies in a joint letter regarding affirmatively furthering fair housing, the new HUD regulation. I wonder what your thoughts are about how that new federal mandate that's been embraced by Secretary Fox should play out in this guidelines process.
Actually, being new to California, I'm still trying to get acclimated. But I think that it's important that we understand what the needs are to make sure that what we are actually moving forward to do on the federal side is actually going to fit what we're trying to do here in California. I'm still trying to come up to speed as to all the needs, but I think that what our Secretary is really trying to do is make sure that that is something that's spread across all the states within the United States to make sure that we are very effective. I am more than willing to take your card and we can collaborate about this a little later because that would be a very interesting topic for us to have here at the division office with our partners. But unfortunately, I'm not that familiar again with everything that's happening in California, but I will open up to have that conversation with you later.
Any other questions? So I'm going to go to the panel. I think I have a few minutes left. I have a couple of minutes. And I just want you all to make news this afternoon, if you would. I mean, if somebody said if you can't go big, go home or something like that. What's your vision for transportation? Because we're looking out at least 20 years, if not 40 years. I think the planning horizon is sort of shifted to where we're actually, with regards to GHG, we're actually looking further out. But I'll just limit it to 20 years. What's your vision of where transportation is going to be? Commissioner Dunn talked about the sharing economy. That's something we're beginning to see. It's not any part of our planning at this point, how Uber or Lyft or Scoop that we saw yesterday fits into how we move people. When you look out 20 years, again from your perspective, and it's a real quick round robin, what's your vision of where transportation might be? And so maybe this would help craft some processes in the guidelines that we're looking at. And I'm going to start with Dr. Smith.
I'd like to see a transportation system that isn't just not harmful, but rather really enhances human well-being in California and equity amongst our various communities.
Oh, that's great. Bold idea.
If you don't want to make news, that's all right. Well, make it quick.
I just like to see where a very minority rather than majority of our population needed cars to get to basic necessities.
Okay, Comey, a transportation system that is progressively less reliant on petroleum, provides consumers with more choices, contributes to a growing economy, and leads to health benefits by virtue of improved air quality.
Thank you.
So I'll be additive to that. We haven't talked about self-driving vehicles and how that's going to potentially radically change how we develop, whether you need parking lots in cities and how you relate that to land use. And there's a fair amount more to say, but that's a pretty different vision than where we are right now.
So I think I scooped Ken earlier, and he scooped me on the autonomous and connected vehicles. I mean, we're talking about 20, 25 years out. Who knows what that's going to add and what that's going to change? I will say this about transportation. We talked today about how transportation and congestion and the condition of the infrastructure is inhibiting our quality of life. Imagine the transportation system, or a transportation system that actually adds to the quality of life in California and adds to the economy. That's the plan that we should be rallying around. And mobility as a service is going to be another thing that we need to talk about. And the ownership of vehicles and the shared mobility and the autonomous vehicle is going to play a big role in that. And I cannot turn the mic off without saying freight, or I'll be in big trouble with. We have to think about freight because the demands is also going to increase in freight, and how are we going to move that freight in a way that's friendly to the environment and also stimulating the economy?
The top one. There you go.
I think that there's a lesson to be learned from what goes on in rural, tribal transportation, that urban transportation can get some pointers on, because it doesn't seem to work in terms of the urban image of transportation. So maybe we need to look around. There's also the issue of who owns the road. And in Indian country, you could have state ownership, tribal ownership, federal ownership, and it can get very complex. So we need to straighten out some of those complexities.
I would say from the federal side, us getting to the point of when we have the decision-making process that is inclusive, that we get to the point where everyone feels as though they are a part of the process, because when we get to the decision-making, to what we want for transportation, I think that we need to make sure that everyone feels as though their voice has been heard.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think I'm way over my time, at least by a few minutes. I want to thank the panel. If you would just help me, I appreciate the panel. And since I don't have any more time, I'm just going to summarize by saying I think the perspectives that you heard today is in essence saying two things. Transportation is very important, which really gives credibility to my job. But secondly, that transportation is about people. And so we have to always think about the people as we plan for transportation. So thank you very much.
And, you know, as this panel is transitioning, I just want to thank all of you, too, for coming here. I know, you know, we had a very esteemed panel here, and everyone was very, very busy, but this sets the platform for moving forward. And I would also like to thank Comey at GC. So we are pulling up the next panel, so if you can just give us a little patience as we regroup here, maybe about 3 to 5 minutes.
Make it work. So, are you ready to become a permanent resident, or are you ready to move back?
Well, if you could dial down the heat, dial it down. Let me introduce you. Introduce yourself.
I'm
Hello, Susan. I bring a special hug from Julie. I saw you. No.
You need to move a little bit.
I didn't realize this was an extra. I didn't quite picture it. It's real life. That's right. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, how are you?
Good and Bishop. Good for you. It's a pretty good combination.
Are you leaving after this?
I am. I'm going to head out and do some more.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have the red light on it when it's on.
Got it.
I gotta go.
Ah.
No, it isn't. It's about how much time you can invest in building your bike riding. Who is that? No, she didn't show first. Yeah, she made it. You want some water? I'll take it. Wait, is this? Yep, that's a good one. Hey, are you getting any emails?
Just that the webcast isn't working.
Okay. Oh, really?
But it is. I'm watching it. So I've had 2 or 3 people saying they're having issues with it. Staff at the office and I are all watching it. Seems to be fine.
So Ken's not here, so. Well, no, I'll go straight down and say that. Whenever you're ready, I noticed that there's a lot of people back there, so give them a 1 minute warning.
All right, if you can hear my voice, 1 minute warning. We're giving you a 1 minute warning. And we're going to start. We've got our panel lined up. Set. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Our next panel, we are thankful to have our MPO, Regional Transportation Planning agencies represented here today to share with you their perspectives on what would be the most important aspects of the RTP guidelines that need amending and what should be included in the California Transportation Plan guidelines. And so today, we're thankful to have Bill Higgins, the Executive Director for the California Council of Governments, here to moderate this panel. So, Bill?
Thank you, Susan, and to the Commission for kicking this off and inviting us all to talk about this very important issue. Also want to thank the Department for the work and the assistance that they're providing. And finally, on behalf of all the MPOs and RTPAs in the state, we appreciate everybody's interest in this. I think to an agency, we all believe and appreciate the additional public input and engagement that these plans have seen in the post-375 era, and our plans are more robust and better for it. So I'm here to introduce the panel that I'd like to make a slight correction from the last panel. This is the panel of agencies that can be left to their own devices and have been leading for the last 10 years. Oh, he's not here, but you take that message, Randall. Okay, thanks. I'm going to quickly introduce the panel that you have before you today, and then we're going to get right to the questions because we only have a short period of time. So we have Mr. Dan Landon from Nevada County. We have Maura Tomey from AMBAG, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments. We have Ted Smalley from Tulare County Association of Governments. Steve Heminger from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And we have Naresh Ameta from the Southern California Association of Governments, sitting in for Hassan Akrata, who had a late-minute cancellation. So I am just going to go right down the row first and start with an opening question. I'm just going to ask you, how has your regional transportation plan changed after the last update of guidelines or after the adoption of SB 375? And we'll start with the non-MPO rural agency first. The mics are on now.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you for making the distinction that we're the non-MPO group here as well. In terms of how we've been changed with regard to SB 375, the rural areas do not have some of the same constraints and requirements that came out of SB 375 as the metropolitan areas. And I think one of the main things that's different now than the last time we worked on this issue is the integration of performance measures and targets. And we're very much into that and working on it, and we're seeing benefits from it already. I think a key that we're going to have to work on as we update the CTP and the RTP guidelines is that we need to define equity, because California is not a homogeneous state. As I'm harking back to a poem I knew in my childhood about an elephant being described by several blind men. And so it depends on what part of the state you're from as to what the state looks like to you. And need and demand are different in different regions of the state. We're going to need the California Transportation Plan to recognize that great diversity in geography, economy, and cultural differences throughout the state. I'll just close by saying that as planners, we are not stewards of infrastructure, we're guardians of community values. And so we need to make those community values come out in our RTPs. They need to be then rolled forward into the California Transportation Plan.
I'm going to put you on every opening panel I do. That was very good. Okay, Mara.
Well, as a very small MPO in a very rural area, the implementation of SB 375 with our first RTP SCS in 2014 was extremely challenging, both from a financial standpoint. It was very costly in comparison to prior plans, but also from trying to help our region understand the value of implementing or developing and implementing an SCS and how that could bring value to their community in terms of a better transportation system, increased sustainability and livability. And I think, you know, the real crux as we move forward for us, as I look forward to our next plan, is that it's important that we keep the momentum going that we had in our first plan. We really had a board and a region and embraced it. It was a struggle. We are a very diverse region. In some ways, we mirror California almost exactly in that we have a coastal region that's older, wealthier, and less diverse. And we have an inland region that's younger, very much poorer, and very diverse. So at times it's very hard to bring consensus in our region, and this new concept of a sustainable community strategy that is valuable for the entire region as a whole was something we had to work hard for. And my concern moving forward is that with limited resources, that if we aren't able to show progress, the plan becomes nothing more than paper as opposed to a route to a better community for our region.
Ted, Mr. Smalley.
For those who don't know, Tulare County is in the San Joaquin Valley. We have 8 counties there in the valley. We're very agricultural based, very high unemployment, and so there are a lot of differences among some of us up here, and I appreciate the last panel and some already bringing this up, that the challenges sometimes differ. But as to how it's changed, certainly the addition of doing a number of land use scenarios, health being involved for the first time and trying to deal with how you measure that, more diverse performance measures and indicators. These are all new items, and as brought up earlier is the expense to do these regional transportation plans every 4 years now. We're certainly very thankful for the federal money we get, but all new tasks in essence now are paid for of local dollars. And so we have to deal with this balance of, in some cases, we are taking money away from capital projects in order to do the planning. So I think that's quite a challenge for us. And as we move forward, always understanding what a true disadvantaged community is. Sometimes in the Valley, we certainly feel very frustrated that there's lots of definitions, but when we have unemployment like we do, and the income levels that are comparative in many cases to Appalachian Mountain region, that's what we think is a disadvantaged community. So I certainly think as we move forward, making sure that that is a key item looking at.
Mr. Heminger.
Thank you, Bill. I think I appreciated the crack about left to their own devices as much as you did. But I always like to take the high road. So I wanted to actually agree with something Ken Alex said, which is that transportation is not an end to itself. And I don't think that is any more in question, as you've heard from my colleagues already. I think the real challenge, and look, the way I tend to put that point is that transportation is a great servant, but it's a lousy master. I think the challenge we've got now is we've got so many masters for these regional plans. It's not just transportation, it's air quality, it's housing, it's economic development, it's environmental protection, it's in the Bay Area sea level rise, it's public health. I mean, it's everything except like the Middle East peace process is now to be commented on, funded, contradicted, influenced by regional transportation plans. And look, it's understandable. They're a nice, inviting target. They have lots of money coursing through them. They're the vehicle that we have, and so we're trying to refashion that vehicle into a broader planning exercise that really is about community planning. And I think that, for the most part, is an altogether good thing. Because I think it does force us as transportation planners out of our silos, and it forces us to look square in the face the fact that that's what we're doing. We're about changing our communities for the better, and how do we make transportation decisions that do that? But I think at the same time we have to acknowledge that advance has come at a cost. And the cost is not only financial. These plans now in the major metros cost millions of dollars, and that's not counting the lawyers that you need to defend the plans after you adopt them. But they also, I think, are really stretching the bandwidth of the staff and the policymakers on these boards, because we are being asked to master entire new areas of policy and discipline. Public health is a very good one. And so, look, I don't want to be misunderstood that we ought to go back to the days when we just had a rifle shot focus on mobility and mobility alone. But I think we also have to acknowledge that as we expand the mandate of these plans, and as we expand the comprehensiveness of these plans, we also stretch not only the financial resources, but just the brain power of everybody who's associated with the debate. Again, I think we're headed in a good direction. I do thank our stars that Senate Bill 375 was passed, because I think housing and transportation were apart in state law for too long. And I think one measure of success, perhaps, back to the old left to their own devices remark, is that we not only for our plan got transportation awards, we got the project of the year from the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. And I take that with a great deal of pride that we are able to surmount these challenges, but challenges they are.
From the Southern California Association Government point of view.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Bill. As Bill alluded earlier, I do want to apologize that my boss, Hassan Ikrada, was expected to be here. He couldn't make it in the last minute, and he sends his regret. The RTP guidelines, from my perspective, has been a good resource for us to put together a plan that we recently adopted, and in fact, it's been approved by federal DOT in terms of conformity, and also by ARB in terms of meeting the GHG targets. A balanced plan that is multimodal, that relates land use to transportation investments as best as we could within the constraints that we have to work under. Freight is a big challenge in our region. It's a big economic driver in our region. It's very important, and so we believe that our plan tackles the freight issues in a very positive and innovative ways. Innovative transportation finance is a big part of the plan as well. And the plan was developed in a very collaborative and a very engaging way, in a way which we've engaged more stakeholders than we've ever did in the past. We did more workshops, reached out to more groups, and so forth. One of the big success, I think, in the last plan was our ability to engage our business leaders early on in the process through what we called the GLUE Council, or Global Land Use and Economic Council, that provided significant input that Commissioner Friendman was earlier alluding to, that the importance of the economy in developing the plan. And so we were able to do that in the last plan. Moving forward, I think from the timing perspective, the timing couldn't be better in terms of dusting up the guidelines and looking for making sure that we're addressing. A lot has happened, obviously, since the last time it was updated, that we reflect, the current, not just in terms of state and federal statutes, but also in terms of what the public wants.
Thank you all, and I will say that I think Steve also answered my second question, which was going to address some of the constraints. But I might ask, and I'll just ask a couple of you this question, so we don't all have to go through, and I'll ask a few questions before I turn it over and let the commissioners ask a couple questions. Maybe describe what the connection is in our plans, because I think that this is there's some misunderstanding between land use and transportation. And what the role of the city and counties are in that, and what the role of the land use projection forecast plan is in our plan. Maybe start with Dan. I'll throw that one to you.
Well, in our case, we are not the agency with land use authority, but we certainly inform and help with the housing issues and the land use issues, and relate back to those with the land use authority what the impacts of their planning are. And so we have to be, by definition, then very collaborative and work with those agencies that do have that authority, so that they understand the impacts and what their land use planning will bring. And I think that's going to be key in achieving in the CTP. There's got to be a recognition of those who are able to make the changes and what changes are desired, so that panel that was before us that talked so much about collaboration and cooperation, those are going to be key, but we have to recognize where that authority resides.
And since we have the winner of the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California Housing Award with us, maybe that they can address, maybe MTC can provide another answer to that.
Well, it's an obvious constraint that in transportation planning, we have placed it at regional agencies, and prior to that, and this is true in every state in the United States, land use planning belongs with local government, and it's not going to change. So what you need is a partnership. I think the very good news that most of us discovered going through these SB 375 plans is we have a lot of willing local government partners. They want to grow denser around their transit nodes. What they want is some help from somebody to help them build the transportation infrastructure and the other community infrastructure that will make that possible. And I would, by the way, put in a plug for the state of California to do some of that. They've started with the cap and trade revenue, but we need a lot more help than that. What we have done in the Bay Area is we stood up in one instance an incentive program. It's called the One Bay Area Grant Program, that essentially rewards local jurisdictions that are building more housing. They get more money from us if they do, and they in return also agree to have a certified housing element and to spend 70% of the money we give any one county in the areas where we and they would like to see greater development. So it's an institutional mismatch that I think we should stop worrying about and wringing our hands about and just make the best of, and forge closer partnerships and forge, I think, an incentive relationship where we're not telling folks what to do, but we're rewarding folks who want to head in the same direction.
Another, I thought it would be good to stop and take a moment and discuss the relationship, everything that you're trying to get done in a regional transportation plan, the links to conformity and everything. Maybe you can outline that a little bit, that it's not just the link to transportation and housing, it fits into the air conformity and the SIP.
I do want to say that one thing we recognized early on is that one size fits all approach doesn't work in our region. We have a huge region, 196 cities, 6 counties. And so what works in Los Angeles County doesn't necessarily work in Riverside or Ventura County for that matter. So recognizing that and also getting the local jurisdictions on board with their own ideas rather than we telling them, how to develop and how to do, and then trying to fit that with the transportation investments was the approach that worked for us.
Mara, maybe I might ask the same question to you about the links to conformity and everything that you're trying to get done.
Well, I think, we have, as Steve mentioned, we have so many masters now, and we're trying to incorporate everything. And it becomes, to some extent, a technological issue in terms of the tools we need in order to produce plans that meet all these requirements. Certainly, modeling is a big key. We can't do the work we need to do to assess our GHG reductions without adequate models. Our region, or the Central Coast, was very lucky that we recently got a grant that will help us move to the next level. But, this is going to be an ongoing issue for all of the regions, not just the smaller ones. And I think that, without those tools, it's hard for us to meet the mandates, particularly of air quality conformity and the issues that we need to address as we move forward in the future.
And Ted, I might just ask the same for you, because I know that you got some interesting news on the air conformity front in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun on air quality. I think what's already been said, I don't want to repeat it all, but when we take the RTP and you have all these complexities, and then on top of which you go to the next level to implement, you have a whole nother level set of planning, and you're trying to pull all this in together. Just makes a great challenge. But I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is to understand that the RTP is a regional plan and not, and we have this challenge educating people, it's not a new super general plan for the county. And educating folks, and then also that it's redone every 4 years. It's not every 2 generations.
So I want to follow up, and Steve, I'm going to give you first crack at this because you brought up the many masters comment. But it struck me during the first panel that for the first time, and it's not like I've done these for a lifetime, but last time the focus was on the RTP guidelines. And this time we're doing the RTP and the CTP 2040 guidelines at the same time. And you mentioned the mini masters. It seems like, is there a way to kind of sort that out? I mean, with all these, can we put some masters in one category or another, or is it just all a big blob in both cases?
Well, I have to confess that the state's transportation plan has always been a bit of a mystery to me. And I know it operates under constraints itself, right? One of them, I think, is a statutory constraint that it can't be project specific. Well, if you have a plan without projects, you've got some nice words, I guess. And I'm sure that probably many of my colleagues would like it to just stay that way, right? But it does seem to me that one of the weak links in our state of California's planning process for transportation is the interregional link. I think things like freight and goods movement tend to get left out of a regional framework. I'll plead guilty to that. In our first SCS plan, we just ran out of time. And as a result, we have now come forward with a regional freight strategy. So we've sort of, I hope, Commissioner Inman, made our amends. But
I was
the fact
after
is
you.
there's only so many hours in a day. And I do think something as important as goods movement is to our state's economy does deserve greater attention. And that shouldn't be the state telling regions what to do or overriding decisions, but it ought to be the same kind of partnership I mentioned earlier between the regional agencies and local government that we do in the land use arena. We ought to have the same kind of partnership with the state on freight. And it seems to me that could be something that the state I know has a freight plan. Maybe we have too many plans now that I think about it, but the state transportation plan, I think, ought to have more meaning if it's going to exist.
Mara, I give you a chance to answer the same question.
Because it's one of my favorite.
Yeah.
I think if we're going to have a state transportation plan and regional transportation plans, I think the big word on the first panel was collaboration. And so I think that those plans need to be integrated and collaborated. I think it's really important that the state sets a vision and that it's an achievable vision, and it turns to the regions to develop plans that can provide practical solutions. And so that our regional plans become the means of which we can move forward the goals in the California Transportation Plan. And to that point, I think it's really important, and I think Dan and the other panel member from SCAG mentioned that flexibility. Not a single one of the 18 MPOs is like the other. We're all very different. Our constituency is different. The communities that our people live in and want to live in are different. And so as we go forward and develop guidelines for a California transportation plan, it needs to be a broad overlay that allows that flexibility. So in the MPO regions, we can develop plans that meet the needs of real people who live in our region, not someplace else in the state.
So before I open it up for questions, well, wait, actually, I'll just ask one more question, just because, and maybe this is a real quick question to the three of you on this corner, because your RTPs are I know, complex documents. How soon, really quickly, how soon do you need to have things firmed up before you're going to take a draft plan to your board? I mean, in terms of scenarios and starting to line up the environmental review. I mean, I'm just trying to give you an opportunity to give the audience an understanding of how much lead time and how complex these are to bring it forward.
It's obviously a 4-year process, and like I said, we just adopted our second round of RTP SES, and we've already started the next process for the next round. And typically, the first couple of years is really to gauge the stakeholders and get as much input as possible from the broader constituents. And then the last 2 years is really when we start looking at different scenarios and doing planning and so on and so forth. So we typically put out our draft plan 6 months before we release adopt the plan itself.
So for us, it turns out that our first SCS was the midpoint of our planning process for that plan. It took us 3 years to get to adoption, and it's 3 years hence as of right around now, and we've got 2 active lawsuits. One of them we just won in the State Court of Appeal today. How about that? But another one's still going on. I think Sandag is still waiting for a Supreme Court decision about their first plan, and they've adopted their second. These are immense sinks of time, these plans, and I do think that's something that we would do well to try to do a little bit of reform. As my friend said, there does seem to be among some folks the view that if you don't get your cracks in on this one, there'll never be another plan. Well, there's one every 4 years. In fact, the next meeting for the next plan will be starting next week, right? It'd be nice if we can get a little bit more of a rhythm developed on that score.
Okay, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. In the Valley, I think we let our modelers have a summer off, and they spend 3 years and 9 months always working on the next RTP. I'm not exaggerating. The modeling is so complex And the more we're asking, and the more upgrades we have to do, it's quite an effort. Besides the modeling, it's 2 years from really once you take the modeling and do the scenario planning and do the outreach, and it's not as if you wait till the end of that 4th year for your RTP. You have to have it done well in advance for all the outreach. And I think that, so it's a quite a complex effort. So every 2 years, really, we're just starting to do the plan again, which, as Steve mentioned, want to reiterate, is again, people then ask, as we're getting ready to go again, well, how come you haven't implemented anything? Well, it's just been 2 years. And it takes a while for things, especially some of the land use impacts, to occur. It could be 2 RTPs down the line.
So I'll take from that, the sooner that these guidelines are done, the sooner that you can use them in your process, because your processes are ongoing. I'm going to open it up and see if the commissioners want to ask this panel any question. If Commissioner Dunn or Kehoe or Inman, if you want to ask.
Well, I want to first thank the panel. I really appreciate you all joining us and hearing your perspective. I think they're very, very important. You know, Steve mentioned resources, and I think, you know, it's one thing to do all these plans, but without the resources, as Maura said, you know, you've got another plan on the shelf, and after a while, our shelves get full, and we don't have much to show for it. So I think without a good resource discussion, you know, maybe we have to go on a plan diet a little bit till we figure out what our resources are going to be. Also, I think the sense of urgency, and I was particularly touched yesterday, we were asked to vote on a motion from the 2000 congestion relief. I forget the exact acronym there, but anyway, it was a list of projects that was generated in the year 2000, and the legislature took action on it for congestion relief. Okay, so now fast forward to 2016, and we're still voting on some of those. So I think the lack of resource investment is a huge challenge for all of us. And then I would just like to encourage us, because I know you all are engaged on a whole bunch of different levels, best practices. Does somebody else do it better? I mean, is there something for us to learn? I know California is unique, but we don't necessarily have a corner on every great idea. So I would be very, very interested from those of you that are active on a number of different associations and have a lot of different touch points. You know, let's talk about what else we could do that might be more effective if our timing's out of whack or whatever. So I think that's just my key takeaways.
If I could just respond briefly to the lessons learned point. I've said this many times. One of the most valuable things coming out of SB 375, especially for the 4 largest MPOs, is that we have been working very closely together on a very integrated basis, not only legislatively, but on planning, on modeling. We've standardized a lot of our assumptions. And I think we have done an immense amount of learning from each other, recognizing our differences. But look, the fact is our plans also have a high degree of commonality in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And I do believe, look, right now, California, there's no one else to learn from in America, right? Because we're the only ones doing this. But I think we still have not tapped the full potential of learning from each other within California. And that includes our partners at the state.
Commissioners Kehoe or Dunn?
I want to join Fran in thanking all the speakers for sharing their thoughts. I tell you, I am sympathetic to what it sounds like, all the busy work that goes into some of these efforts, the overlapping plans, the overlapping timelines, things, you know, bunching up on each other and just kind of going through the pipeline. I'd be willing to help with looking at how improvements could be made to the process, as long as we are, maintaining our commitment to community input and to resource protection, natural resources, as opposed to, financial resources. Though I do acknowledge we need more money in transportation and, some of these steps, like the road charge pilot, are moving in that direction. So we've got a lot of work to do. It is very complicated. The difference between, Tulare and San Diego and lots of other places in the state are pretty enormous. The one-size-fits-all in California especially is always a challenge, but, I do thank you for all your efforts and for sharing all your knowledge with us today, or at least 4 minutes each, whatever you got.
Ditto. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments. Just a couple of things as you were chatting. It is amazing to me, each of your regions, you're made up of regional planning, but you have a lot of elected officials, city officials, county officials that are part, and certainly thank you, SCAG, for the Glue Council. I think it was genius effort. I say that with a complete bias, being a member of that council and getting to input into SCAG. It's wonderful to have that business community available to there, not only to challenge, but also then to be marketeers for you once a plan gets done. We're out there, first ones at the microphone in support, so a genius move. But the regional planning aspect of it, just I would love to see that a little in all of your work and in the way we think about the guidelines. How can we deep dive further so that each of those city leaders recognizes that they helped develop the plan, but now part of their job is making sure that their own cities understand the importance of the plan and sort of the unusual tools and the laws that have gone into effect into making that plan real. So we need to figure out that drill down aspect of it. Again, it gets back to give us the public tools we need to educate our constituencies that there's a new thinking up here that might be counterintuitive to them, but it would end up working in their benefit at the end. The second point is, of 3 points here, is the litigation component is just a joke. It's a complete joke, and we've got to figure that thing out and figure out a way to do these plans where it's just not a lawyer full employment act. And so enough said on that. You all have to live it, but I just find it appalling that we can't figure that trick out. And the third, from my friend Mr. Heminger, I know you love SB 375. I am not alone when I say that I'm so disappointed in 10 years of that law on the book. Transportation folks are not very good about planning the housing component of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the housing crisis we are in. And so I would challenge you, the CEQA exemption doesn't work. No one's taking advantage of it. Be careful about SB 375 and how can we actually make that work where we're doing more effective planning in housing and transportation, that it meets the spirit of what the law was intended to. I'm continue to be troubled by that, and I look at the governor's, for example, full-throated endorsement. I look at the governor's trailer bill language on a real CEQA reform measure in his by right proposal coming before us now as one of the first. I mean, that's what SB 375 was all about, right? Helping infill development, and yet our local governments oppose it. So kind of like an interesting dynamic as we all have to do the dance in doing these plans. And God bless you for your work, because it's really tough. And appreciate your leadership and your comments today.
Well, it's always nice to end with a blessing. I think, Dan, you have something to say.
Well, I just wanted to comment, and I picked up from Commissioner Inman about resources, and I would, most of the rural counties, we don't talk about SB 375, we talk about SB 45, and how it married interregional needs and regional needs. And right after that project, or that bill passed, we went to work, and in a county that gets about $4 million a STIP cycle, we've brought $110 million worth of improvements to our county through partnership and collaboration with Caltrans. Right now, we're trying to keep that alive, but our partner is out of money. And so we desperately need the state to figure that out and be able to come back to the table so we can continue that kind of improvement. And just, I'll close my plea for the rurals. You know, we talk about resources, but rural California residents shoulder about 3 times the amount of cost per lane mile as do urban residents. So there's clearly a disproportionate burden there. And the pavement condition index in rural areas averages 58 as compared to 66 in the rest of the state. So we've got some work to do to get us up to an equitable level.
I have a couple minutes. I can take some questions from the audience. We have one from the internets. That was a joke. Why don't you read that, Doug? I'm more.
Sure.
Yeah. Or you shorten it.
Sure. Lynn Goldsmith from Sacramento. Collaboration and partnerships have been emphasized. Stakeholders include the public, but talk is about top-down. Her questions are, will engagement be ongoing and begin to include the public? Will engagement begin to be the hard work of communication out in the neighborhoods before policies are developed or proposed?
Mara.
Well, I'll take a crack at that because I think the best thing about the current planning process is that we do start from the bottom up. Scenario planning is all about going out to the community and talking to the community members about what their real needs are, not what we as planners think they are, and then building scenarios that then develop into a plan that represent those needs. A good example in our region is because we are so diverse, one of the key elements that really came from the more rural inland valleys was the real need for economic development. And so our ultimate strategy rolled that piece in, which was not originally on the table. And so it really talked about how the communities, the real voices out in our jurisdictions developed the plan, not AMBAG.
So I know that I'm about to get the end times going, and I don't see anybody racing for a question out there. So that meant we articulately told the story up here. So I'm gonna take, Dan, your last remark as a closing remark, and I'm just gonna go 1, 2, 3 for your these 4 panelists get the last word, starting with Naresh, then Namara, then Ted. I'm gonna give Steve the last word because he always has a good metaphor.
I just want to again thank you for having me here today. I think this is a good starting point, a good dialogue to start looking at the guidelines, and I think it's going to be very productive, and I hope to be engaged in the process as we move forward.
Mara.
I just hope that the CTP, RTP guidelines process is a process that will help us build a framework for us to build on for the future, and particularly beyond our current fiscally constrained environment.
From my perspective, I would hope as we move forward that we would remember that word flexible, and I think it's been echoed many times in 2 panels. We're not all the same. We can't have rigid guidelines that treat us all the same. So I hope that as we move forward, we will keep that into account.
Bill, I'll just say that I'm looking forward especially to the next 2 panels because if the environmental and business communities in our state and in any of our regions can get together and make some headway, we're really going to make some progress. These plans don't make things happen. These plans are permissive. What we need is leadership to make things happen at both the regional and state level.
And that's a good note to close on. Join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you all. So we'll take about maybe a 2-minute break as we have the panel switch here, and then we'll start up again.
Hey, buddy. Oh, it was a crazy day.
How are you? Good. How you doing? I'm doing fine. Good. Good. Look, I knew I knew he was going to get that. I wish he was here actually to hear the flak, the blowback. That was to be expected. Yeah. Yeah. We can talk about something besides Great thus far. Really good discussion. Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it'll set a platform for us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to take notes, but
Mm-hmm.
what I didn't hear a lot of in the science. I had to ask them this. We should get more about interrelating,
The RTP.
the RTP.
Yeah, the RTP guidelines. Yeah.
But it is true. It's a project list.
No, that
we would have a seat.
that was one of the more salient comments related to the relation between the two. I was like, oh, I mean that's a very good point as to why it's a little bit more kind of one it makes it difficult to directly tie the two together when you've got kind of higher level language that speaks more in conceptually in generalities. I think that there is still a degree of language that can be made, but nonetheless. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, Sarah. Nice to see you again.
Yes, Sarah, pleasure to see you as well.
See you. Good to see you. I'm
Thank
doing
you for
well.
coming today.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm not getting it across in my remarks how appreciative, the folks that are coming here today is just wonderful.
No, I think it's
really
great.
appreciate it.
No, thanks for doing this. It was very brilliant on your part to bring everybody together,
Pull
right?
everyone together. Oh
Make
yes.
sure that one thing having all the key players in all this leading the efforts.
Mm-hmm.
At least we
my water.
what we're doing, so we'll be sure we have hopefully participation.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll be back from break. Give you a second.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Your whole day. Is it? Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure I got it right. Okay. So got it.
Yeah, it doesn't have the accent, but usually the
And
accent.
there's a couple other names that I've got to.
It doesn't have an accent. I mean, it's pronounced with the accent, but there is not one.
And I'm gonna dive. I know we didn't talk too much beforehand, but I'll dive in pretty quick. We give some very brief sort of framing, and then each of you guys have roughly 5 minutes. Yeah. So I might ask like one broader framing question. Obviously, take it where you see fit, and we'll have maybe a little bit of dialogue before opening up to the commissioners and then questions.
Technical Advisory Committee. And Richard's on it, but I didn't know who to, I was trying to get an equity representative. I remember your name because I actually really don't know anything about it. I think you might have been out or something. I was trying to get a committee.
She's here.
Janelle might have stepped out.
Yeah,
She was at the back.
Yeah.
I just haven't seen her yet. Okay. Hello. How are you? Good to see you. My hands are very cold. I'm sorry.
Mine are usually that way. This is
Yeah.
kind of an anomaly.
Freezing. And Liz. Trying to keep track of everyone. Okay.
Should we just sort of sit in the middle, or where's a good
Yeah. If
place?
you guys don't want to like stack up the middle, if you please.
Okay.
I think I asked Laura, it's going to be Liz, Chanel, and then you.
Yeah.
Okay. And legal is the last name.
Latina, but it's
Yeah.
not a Latina
Yeah.
name.
Yeah. Legal is the one I want. Okay. Got it. Legal.
Anna, do you remember Anna? We worked together before. We had a colleague, she used to call me Chioni Segada.
Oh.
Like no.
Thanks
Nope,
for...
it's not the Mexican name.
It's
That's
not
the
that.
Mexican name.
Shoni Fleagle. Legal. Okay.
That's legal.
Yes.
Chanel should be
that
here,
sounds
and then
okay.
Liz is ready. Do you want me to go get her?
I was
like,
just
pull her up?
explaining earlier.
Okay.
To
Okay.
Sarah and Elizabeth earlier too that I'll give a very brief framing first, like one sort of broader question to you guys.
I will. I mean, I'll
How
just
you
sort
see
of...
fit and what,
Yeah.
5 minutes, of course. So a pretty generous amount of time. A little bit of back and forth before the
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't
weigh in,
going
and
to sort
then
of go into a lot of detail because there isn't.
That sounds good.
But just to sort of frame it up as like,
Yes,
this
yeah,
is an
yeah.
opportunity.
As long as you guys can center yourselves as the center of attention.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's concerns about
Yes,
So
Liz?
we'll work with
Yeah, I feel like even giving like almost like a 60-day comment period instead of a 30-day comment period, because that just even provides. Because like we couldn't, I mean, we would like to get some input from community partners and like we couldn't even start those scheduling until the end of July. And then if the comment period closes, like it's like, you know what I mean? That's awesome.
A little bit about what the organization does.
Yeah. So that's what okay, good. Because we were like,
You're back?
Yeah.
I was waiting for you until you come back. Yeah. No, didn't want you to miss it. All right, this is the 1 minute warning. 1 minute. Do you see her?
Waiting for one more. So.
I need to just.
Yeah, please. Yeah, no, take your time. And we've got 30 discussion. And I know we're a little bit. We started the whole thing. Okay. You'll give me a heads up when we're. Jose right there in the middle. Got it.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you for having me. I was like, that's nice.
Hi,
Hey.
Chanel. Good to see you.
I feel like I should hug
I
you,
know,
right? I was
yeah.
like, I was going in for that, and I was like, I'm not sure.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's
Awesome. Good to see you too.
Yeah, that's what I've been telling them. Like 5 minutes. 5 minutes each. Oh, okay. Whenever you're ready.
Well, let's wait for it.
Yeah, let's wait for it.
I'll get started. All right, we're going to convene with our third panel. This is a panel that will share an environmental and equity perspectives on moving forward on this update for the RTP guidelines and the CTP guideline development. And I'd like to first thank the panel and also would want to introduce you to Randall Winston, the Executive Director for the Strategic Growth Council. Randall, we're grateful to you for being here today.
Thank you, and thank you. Thank you all, and thank you so much, Susan, again for inviting me here today, and thank you, commissioners, as well. I think we heard in the opening panel stressed a number of times the critical importance of equity and issues around equity, particularly with regard to the update of both guidelines. And that is what we are here to discuss. So we'll dive in very soon here, but just want to outline a few of the broad issues that hopefully you all can touch upon before we dive in. So we're going to, again, broadly look at areas of environmental conservation, sustainability, social equity and environmental justice, active transportation, and public health. I think we'll want to hear all of your perspectives on what worked, what hasn't worked, both in regional and local planning guidelines, and maybe at the same time or before that you can share a little bit about your organizations, and you'll have each 5 minutes. But let me quickly introduce the very stellar panel that we have here today to engage in the discussion. We have Liz O'Donoghue, who's the Director of Infrastructure at the Nature Conservancy, Chanel Fletcher, the Associate Director at Climate Plan, Shioni Flegel, Director of Policy Link, and Sarah DeGia, who's the Executive Director of the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network. I'm going to just say a couple few points here, and then maybe one broad framing question before you all dive in. I'll reiterate the importance that Ken Alex he mentioned earlier on when in the opening panel. One, that these guidelines represent not only an opportunity, I think, to tie together a lot of our state's broader climate goals, but also to provide guidance and guidance beyond just our statutory requirements. I think you heard referred to in the last panel by my friends Mr. Bill Higgins and Steve Himminger from MTC. I think what Ken had mentioned about the NPOs and left to their own devices. I think while that was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, what he really meant, to my mind, I think, is something that's been emphasized throughout the day, which is that there may be differences amongst many of the groups here and moving forward, but what's really important is the need for partnerships and for all of us to collaborate and working to find solutions. And so while we'll continue to, I think, have areas of disagreement, I think we really need to come together to achieve our statewide goals and get the guidelines to where they need to be. So with that, let me just ask maybe one framing question to you all. Answer it how you wish, and we'll go from there. So broadly, are we encouraging the consideration of equity in the guidelines, and more specifically, transportation cost burden and transportation access by disadvantaged communities? And if and where we are, how can this be strengthened? And to the extent that we're not, where are the opportunities in the guidelines, and what would you recommend? So maybe we'll start at the end, if we could, with Chanel. Is your mic on?
Is my mic on? That's a good question.
It is with the, yeah, and you've got some buttons right here.
I have some buttons. All right, I'm good. Thank you. And so before I kind of dive into those questions, I will follow the instructions and give a little background on climate plan. And so first, I also want to just thank the commission and thank all of you guys for being here and for having me on this panel. I think as stated, my name is Chanel Fletcher. I'm the Associate Director of Climate Plan. If you are wondering what and who is Climate Plan, we are ultimately a network of over 50 organizations really committed to improving land use and transportation planning to protect our health, communities, climate, and ultimately our environment. And so I think Climate Plan, historically, we've been really involved and invested in the implementation of SB 375 even before its passage. And really, we've been working with our partners and honestly elevating a number of our local and regional partners' work on the Regional Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy. And so for us to be on this panel, what we really hope to bring is that sense of we're looking at the best practices. And so I think it was Commissioner Inman, I think she left, but she mentioned, is there anybody out there looking at best practices, thinking about what's been happening in the different regions and what we can move forward? Climate Plan is doing that right now. And so as a shameless plug, I do want to mention that we are going to be releasing a best practices report of the best practices in the SCS. And part of that is sharing out some of the learning that we've seen, some of the innovative practices that we hope can get replicated across the regions, while understanding that every region is different. I think to kind of answer that question around equity, I feel like, with Shioni and Sarah on this panel, I think both of their organizations are very steeped in the equity conversation. And so I think I would feel a little bit remiss to try to take that space. But I do have a couple of points that I think that the RTP guidelines can include that really, I think, would elevate equity, while also, I think, thinking also about other benefits like public health, conservation, and the like. And again, knowing that Liz is also on this panel. So the things that I think I kind of thought about in terms of the equity piece was really affordable housing. And I think, as Commissioner Dunn mentioned, we are in an affordable housing crisis. And I think that these guidelines, particularly if you look at the RTP plans in different regions, they can really provide a strong framework to address that affordable housing crisis and really, I think, promote some transformative land use policies that can curb against displacement. I think that's something that we're seeing that's really big and that's really happening, not just in the Bay Area, but also in Sacramento and other different regions. And so that's one place where I think we can build upon the learnings that are happening in places like, MTC, where they have this displacement analysis. So that's one thing that I think I was really thinking through. I think the other piece really goes back to that transportation investments. And so really investing in transportation projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve public health, protect social equity, or promote social equity and protect natural lands. And so I think what that looks like is selecting the best transportation projects in a transparent process. And so what that means is that reducing the amount of committed projects that automatically get included, working with stakeholders to really create a robust public process that creates some criteria about which projects we are going to advance. And again, this isn't, it's not rocket science, it's happening across the regions that we've seen as well. I think the other big piece of it is making sure that we evaluate the impacts of transportation investments on the most vulnerable communities. Super important that this is happening and that we're really thinking about how does this transportation investment, what are the negative benefits, or no, that's the wrong word, negative impacts. The negative impacts, how do we mitigate those, and what are the benefits that are happening? I think I have less than a minute left, so I did want to touch upon the modeling. Modeling is hugely important, and so making sure that the modeling piece is accessible so that we can understand what you are showing us, making sure that we have the best modeling tools available, and I think most importantly is making sure that modeling outcomes do not act as a substitute for investments and policies. So that's my long answer to that question.
Great, thank you, Chanel. Really, really great set of issues surface, and look forward to the best practices being released that you mentioned. Liz.
There you go. Okay. So do you want me to answer that question, or should I, because I was prepared some remarks.
Please, go forward with your remarks.
Okay. Well, first, I do also want to just echo what Chanel said about answering the question. And also, we at the Nature Conservancy don't see ourselves as equity experts, but we see ourselves as equity allies. And so I think a lot of what Chanel said and what you're going to hear from Shioni and Sarah, we fully subscribe to as well on that equity question. So just to back up, my name is Liz O'Donoghue. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and we work on conservation of natural lands and working lands throughout California. And I was going to start my remarks talking about the broad vision of where we wanted to see transportation go. And it turns out that it's a lot like what we've already heard. So it's not just, I think it's, as Ken might have said, just about transportation, but it's about the implementation and the integration of a lot of different parts of society and factors and stakeholders that result in a sustainable view of where we're going to go. And so that is not just about choosing transportation projects, it's about land use considerations, environmental, housing, and other decisions that result in equitable, healthy, and economically thriving and climate-adapting communities that meet the demographics of today. And I think not just with SB 375, but for the past 10 or 15 years, we've been seeing a lot of research, a lot of practical application of taking the decisions of the past and really integrating them with land use and housing decisions. And what we've seen is that has really broadened the stakeholder base of people who come to meetings and take this arcane process of RTP and CTP development and actually make it real. And in California, there's been a lot of innovative things that have happened both at the state level and the regional level. But we really have a long way to go. We continue to be attached to legacy lists of projects. Very few entities actually look at those projects and do cost-benefit analyses. The MTC is doing those on the big projects. But I think that we should really take opportunity to step back and look at how these projects and how the system as a whole meets our climate goals, our conservation goals, our equity goals, our health goals, our active transportation and transportation goals. But as we've been hearing, SB 375 has really resulted in a sea change of activity and who's been involved in decisions. And so after the first round of SCSs were done, the Nature Conservancy wanted to step back and actually see what practices and what policies were integrated that relate to conservation in SCSs. And so we commissioned this report that we released a couple months ago, and it's called Sustainable Community Strategies and Conservation. And we looked at all the first round of SCSs. We interviewed all the MPOs. We brought in colleagues from the conservation, equity, and active transportation and transportation world and did workshops on looking at what provisions were included, what did advocates actually ask of MPOs to be included, but didn't make it, and then what are best practices? And I do have to say, in the interest of flexibility, that we had first started thinking, well, let's come out with a model policy. But in the development of that work, we realized that all California is not the same, that regions and counties and the state have different political, cultural, financial resources. And so we have a series of best practices listed in there. And so I can provide that for anybody who would like to see. I see that I just have a couple minutes left. So I just want to say a couple of things. One, I think that we should make sure that the RTP and CTP guidelines align with more recent policies like the executive order on climate, like AB 498 that deals with habitat connectivity. I think we need to improve on performance metrics and especially include metrics that deal with conservation. I think better modeling is really important. We need to look at better scenario development modeling like urban footprint. There is a wealth of information on here on practices and policies that really cost no more money, but taking data layers, for example, and integrate them with, comparing them with housing and transportation choices and see how a complete community can be developed. Integrating habitat plans like NCCPs, guidance on climate adaptation, and I have a lot more, but I'm not going to bore you with that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment, and I look forward to being involved more and more in these discussions.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz, and for raising all those very, I think, timely issues, and look forward to discussing them further, hopefully, in our discussion. Shioni?
Good afternoon. My name is Shioni Flegel. I work with a national organization named PolicyLink. We're based here in Oakland, California. Our work is really focused on advancing equity for low-income communities and communities of color. As we were founded, a big focus of that work was really thinking about how regional growth and development supported our aspiration to create a more equitable society. We think about equity as being just and fair inclusion of all people into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Lots of folks ask us why equity and transportation policy, why equity and regional planning, and we really believe that those things link up in really profound ways. Just to start, I want to point out that we don't believe that equity is something you should do just because it's the kind thing to do or the nice thing to do. There's actually a huge body of research, and those who've heard me or my colleagues speak previously have heard this, but there's a huge body of research that proves that inequality and racial segregation hinder growth, prosperity, and economic mobility in regions, while equity and inclusion fuel innovation, business success, and economic growth and help sustain that growth over time. So from our perspective, equity is not just the nice thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do as you think about growing your regions. Transportation planning and investment has played a profound role in shaping our cities and regions in ways that drive inequality, but it can also play a profound and transformative role in providing new solutions and addressing inequalities. To realize this aspiration, we think that we need to do things very different, and our RTP guidelines can help facilitate that. I'm going to really talk about three things that we'd like to see different as we move through our RTP process. Many of them Liz and Chanel touched on, and I'm sure Sarah will touch on them first as well. The first and probably most important is this idea of community participation and really having an inclusive process. One of the earlier speakers talked about planners as being the stewards of community values. I'm trained as a planner. I worked as a planner before I was at PolicyLink, and I believe that. That's what we're taught as planners. But that only works if the community is actually there to articulate their values. And too often in planning processes, large portions of our community, often those who are most impacted by the decisions that are being made, are not being included in the process. So their values, their aspirations are not then reflected in what's produced in our plans. We would like to see the RTP guidelines really help articulate a much more robust framework for how regional planning processes around transportation achieve this goal of inclusivity. The second point or piece that we think needs some more attention goes really to what Liz talked about, that in addition to meeting our climate and housing mandates set out in SB 375, the RTPs should be responding to identified community priorities. This might be a set of priorities around public health. It might be a set of priorities around job access. But the plans need to be thinking about how the transportation investments and how the transportation projects that we're investing in support those other community aspirations. I'm going to skip, because I'm short on time, to really the last point, which is around sequencing. And I don't think anyone's talked about this yet, but one of the problems we saw with the first round of RTPs is that even when MPOs were putting in really valuable projects that communities had identified, they were often put in at the end of the plan, or they were put in with no committed funding. So while it was important and showed some movement to see them in those plans, in practical terms, it left communities feeling like those changes were pretty meaningless. So as we move forward, we really want to see those community identified priorities front-loaded into plans. We want to see committed funds going to those kinds of projects, and really see that the community voice is reflected in the full plan before it's adopted. And I'm going to pause and move to Sarah.
Great, thank you so much, Shioni. It was great to hear, and we'll I'm sure be discussing more as well. Sarah.
Sure. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. The California Pan-Ethnic Health Network is a multicultural health policy organization, and our focus is on improving the health of communities of color in California. So you may be wondering why a health policy organization is at a transportation meeting. And that's in part because we were engaged in the passage of Assembly Bill 441, which states that in the next round of the update of the RTP guidelines, there will be an index included that outlines some of the best practices highlighting health and health equity based on the MPOs. And so first, I just want to take the opportunity to thank the CTC and Susan and also Caltrans for having this meeting, because it is a really important time. We talked a lot about partnerships today, and in order to make those partnerships and build those partnerships, we have to get to know each other. And so I think this has been a really great way to do that. And also for inviting Dr. Smith to share the public health perspective and having that public health work group. But I also want to commend the MPOs, many of whom are their efforts that they're doing are an important way to shape the efforts that we're encouraging in this this process. And lastly, just thank the SGC and the Health and All Policies Task Force for advancing this concept of health and equity. So my comments will answer that question, but also provide a little context for why we think health is important. But I just want to say that I think this is a really exciting time and opportunity to be talking about this. And in part, it's because communities of color are and have been the majority of California since 2000. That's almost 2 decades. And population trends suggest that these are only going to continue, particularly for our youth and also for our aging communities. And so the chance to reshape our guidelines and consider their needs is really important, because historically low-income communities of color, immigrant, and limited English proficient communities have been the most impacted by health inequities. And by health inequities, I mean discrimination and lower wages and planning decisions that have resulted in health disparities like asthma and obesity and pedestrian fatalities. So our communities are living shorter lives, and it's largely due to preventable health disparities. And so we even convened a group of advocates who work with communities of color in California, and we asked them what are some of the greatest barriers to health. And the number one reason, or the number one barrier, was access to affordable and accessible transportation. Because transportation is that link, as somebody mentioned, to housing, to jobs, to food, to healthy, to physical activity. So when we're talking about health and equity in transportation, we have a tremendous opportunity to improve the lives of many who have historically had, whose communities have been disinvested. So Dr. Smith also highlighted some some of the direct and indirect impacts of health. And studies have even showed that, children's development accelerates faster when they live in a walkable and mixed-use community. So, we know that transportation planning hasn't always had the interests of these communities in mind. And so I think as we go forward, and particularly with the implementation of AB 441, we know that we can do better. And so a couple of ways that I think as we implement this, 4 aspects that I'd like to highlight is, number one, that California has made these really great strides into improve air quality, active transportation, investing in disadvantaged communities. And now we have the opportunity even further align those efforts. So to not keep them as separate plans, but to actually integrate them in a way and thinking about how our transportation will be planned in the future. And we worked really closely with the Office of Planning and Research to update the general plan guidelines and include a health and social equity factor. And so there's a lot of best practices that I think could be learned from that. That the appendix also has the opportunity to find some of the key terms that we're talking about. What is health equity? What is social equity? What are disadvantaged communities? So to get on the same page and make sure that we're speaking each other's language, because as health policy advocates, we don't talk transportation talk. And so it's good for us to come together and be able to do that definition together. But it's also, as somebody mentioned a little earlier today in the MPO panel, we don't want necessarily MPOs to have to become experts in public health. What we want to do is encourage and facilitate those partnerships at the local and statewide level so that we can take the tools that are already there and utilize them in this planning process, but to be more mindful about that as we go forward. And last, just to echo, so my time is up, so I want to just echo what Shioni said around community engagement, and that this is really an opportunity to expand that, to be more inclusive and transparent, and again, learning from other opportunities. So I'll stop there and say thank you again for the opportunity.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and I think you sort of surfaced some issues that are going to lead to my first question here. You mentioned Dr. Smith's comment from the opening panel, and one thing that she touched upon as an area of kind of prime importance with regard to equity was focus on access to destinations. I'm wondering if each of you could take a moment to talk about the importance of access to destinations and maybe how that is balanced or interrelates to mobility.
I can start because that was in my comments that I didn't get to share. So I think a really good place to look at is like the Alameda County study. They looked at budget cuts, but the impact of budget cuts on public transportation. So we know that low-income communities of color utilize public transportation far more often than other communities, and they're also more likely to not own a car. So the ability to access public transportation that's, again, accessible and affordable is so important. So the study showed, I'll just highlight a couple of the key findings, that there was an increased stress, and we know that stress has a negative impact on somebody's body and their mind, right? So the ability the longer commute times that not just individuals working had to endure, but also students, less sleep, less social interaction, which we know is really important for our aging communities. For low-income communities, we also know that the higher that costs go up for for transportation, they're forced to make trade-offs, that they can't, they may not be able to afford food, or then they have to decrease the opportunity to go see their friends, or in some cases even be able to go to the doctor. So somebody with a chronic health condition, that's really important. So I think having that mobility or that lack of access to mobility and affordable transportation really does potentially cut off that vital link for being able to have a job, and it also resulted in increased driving times, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do with the planning of transportation, is to decrease our VMT so that we don't have those negative footprints on climate change. So really it's a full circle. It impacts people's lives in so many different ways.
Building off of Sarah, I think in the work that we do, transportation is such a fundamental tool for our communities to access the full range of opportunities that they need. As we look at services, education, jobs, health, recreational opportunities across the board, transportation is the factor that either facilitates or limits many low-income communities and communities of color from really fulfilling their aspirations in that space. In California, we know that lack of transportation are actually one of the leading causes of school truancy, being tardy, missing school entirely, et cetera. I sit on a school site council in Oakland, and it's one of the challenges our council is grappling with is we can't get our kids to school because they don't have a bus. So the idea that transportation is benign in someone's life really is so far from the reality. And I think all of us in this room know that that's not the case, but we haven't done a good enough job in our local and regional planning processes of really thinking through how how transportation is felt differently by different communities. And then just finally to recall, I think it's not surprising that transportation was really at the cornerstone of the start of the civil rights movement, that transportation has always been part of the struggle for disenfranchised communities who are aspiring to a better life. So as we think about who is in our state today, Sarah did a great job speaking to the demographic change happening. Many of these communities have lacked adequate access to transportation and have really suffered as a result. We have an opportunity to change that as we move forward.
Liz? So I think that's a great question, Randall, because it really can tie into so many of the things that we're talking about. And so listening to what Sarah and Shioni said, and then what I reflected on was how access to parks and open space are really critical components of a healthy lifestyle. And we've seen that in particularly areas of disinvestment in disadvantaged communities, there are park poor communities. And we're seeing that open space where doctors in the Bay Area and elsewhere are writing park prescriptions, where if you go to your doctor and your doctor is noticing that you have high levels of stress, she may write you a prescription that says, go take a walk in a park for 30 minutes a day on a pad of paper. And Kaiser is doing that, and they have a whole park prescription program. But one of the critical problems is getting access, both location of parks and open space, but access to open space where you can actually get on a bus and find yourself at a beautiful trailhead that provides both mental and physical health abilities. And so in some areas, there are programs called Transit to Trails. In the Bay Area, there's a program called Transit to Trails. I remember about 15 years ago, I was visiting Vancouver, BC, and I was able to go from downtown Vancouver, take a bus, and then take a hovercraft and another bus, and I was at a trailhead. It took me about an hour, but I was able to do it, and I thought, wow, wouldn't this be great if this can be done everywhere? And so I think it's linking those community values and then designing the transportation system to meet those values and those needs that are really critically important.
Yeah, and so I've been sitting here, and I think what I was struck most by, I was thinking about Commissioner Dunn's example about the mom who was like working, and then she had to go a 2-hour commute to try to make that Girl Scout meeting. And I think part of what was triggered for me was because I was a Girl Scout, so I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. But I think the other part of it to me is that to me is also, I think, indicative of how we have planned our communities and really hits to this point about how do we get to where we're going and what do we invest in, right? And so that mom is probably had invested in a car because she's like, that's the fastest way I'm gonna get home to get to this Girl Scout meeting to, help my daughter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what I feel like what we're trying to do at Climate Plan and trying to work with regional and state agencies on is how do we I think outside of what we've been doing for the past 50 years? How do we think outside of like cars and freeways and highways and expansion and start really thinking about and investing in how do we build communities where we don't have to get in that car, or better yet, where we don't have that 2-hour commute. So I think that gets into like the idea of like jobs housing balance. That gets into the idea of thinking about when we're talking about planning, where are the jobs at, where's the housing at, how do we build transit, how do we build in structures so that people don't have to rely on the car. And I think that has benefits, not just, I think, obviously for disadvantaged communities, which I think we are, adamantly support, but also for, again, that hassled mom like myself who's just like, I have to leave here and go to get childcare, and how am I going to get there? And so that's, I think, the part that to me is so important when we're talking about, again, transportation investments and where we invest our money. Part of it starts with the planning, and then I think from the planning, the next step is that we shape our transportation investments so that we are building those communities.
Thank you. Commissioners Dunn and Kehoe, questions or comments?
I always learn so much when I listen to these folks. They're all great skilled presenters in their own right, and I really thank you for your thoughts. I'm particularly fascinated too because we've talked so often about doing transit-oriented housing, but shouldn't we be thinking about doing jobs-oriented transit? Let people live where they want, but get them so that they can take to job centers. So I think we should be thinking in a whole bunch of other ideas that help people get on those alternative transportation modes that we're all talking about. And again, the innovators are so far ahead of any of us great thinkers that they're already trying to figure out ways to get mom to her Girl Scout meeting, and we can't even envision yet what they're already putting on books and things that will help our planet in addition to meeting the goals. But thank you all for always keeping us in that right mindset, is that you have to have balance in everything we do. It's very good.
Thank you. Great perspectives from each of you. Really appreciate it. Randall, you steered the conversation very well, and it was great topics, thought-provoking to begin with. And I could respond to, dozens of your remarks, but I just want to say a few things. Mainly, what I've heard in each of the panel discussions is our challenge is to take these wonderful big picture 30,000 feet concepts and get them down into the neighborhoods, down into the bus lines, down into the job locations. And so we have to do that by continuing to communicate and collaborate, as we've heard on each of the panels, whether it's federal, state, or local. And we understand there's challenges to looking at transportation planning through a public health lens, through a jobs lens, through an open space lens, but that's what we're setting out to do. So we have to, batten down the hatches and get to work. I loved what some things that you mentioned were really important to me. The public health links are very important. The sequencing idea is very important in the I-5 corridor project that we adopted this morning. One of the big pushes was to move the community benefits up earlier in the project rather than at the end or the last 10 years of the 40-year plan. And we did that successfully, and it was a real boon to the communities that were impacted and to the open space and natural resources advocates. So I'm very pleased with that. There's a we also want to look at the parks idea and connecting parks to communities. I co-chair the Parks Forward Commission here in the state, and parkscriptions are one of the themes. Getting urban residents closer to our state parks, it's a challenge. There are new programs linking bus and other kinds of transit service to parks that are distant. It's very important to keep working on that. These are in the early stages, but it helps the communities. It helps diversify park participation and park support for our public parks, which we need. And it improves, of course, the health and the outlook and the outcomes for the people that are enjoying recreation and our beautiful outdoors. Transportation is the essence of connectivity. We've been talking about connectivity off and on all day. If you can't reach where you want to go or the person you want to see, your life is definitely diminished. I live a couple miles, I think, probably from Fashion Valley, Mission Valley Shopping Center. Hundreds of thousands of square foot of retail, probably hundreds and hundreds of jobs. It's a 20-minute drive, but if I take the bus, it's over an hour and a half because I have to transfer and this and that. And there's people that work there that don't have a bus. There's waitresses and there's sales clerks and there's bus boys and there's all that. And, it is a real struggle for them. Plus they're paying, I think, $3 a leg now in San Diego and no free transfers. These really impact low-wage workers. So transportation and quality of life are definitely interlinked. It is part of, it is going to impact your health outcomes. And so, I just really enjoyed hearing from each of you. Your perspectives are important. This is not going to be an easy transition. I am also mindful that we can put in so many details that these plans will collapse of their own weight. We need effective plans that are going to get the job done. We're not about compliance, we're about positive outcomes and results. So we don't want 500 more pages. We want many more good projects. I'd leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Commissioners Kehoe and Dunn, for those comments and for your leadership and for all of your leadership. I think we've got a few minutes here left for questions for those in the audience. Any questions? And I think we do have one question on Bill's internets.
We do. Lee Otter, the Transportation Liaison for the California Coastal Commission. And Lee, we're going to shorten your question up a little bit. The question surrounds the protection of the coastal zone and its resources as one of the primary considerations for the state of California. And he has a number of bullet points that are the key issues. But there's three questions he's asking. How do we harmonize the CTP guidelines with the land use policies of the California Coastal Act? How do we harmonize the RTP guidelines with many of the certified local coastal programs? And what local coastal program updates might be needed for the state's future transportation system?
Challenging set of questions.
So I think that's a great question, especially since our coast is really vulnerable to sea level rise. And we also have one of the state's most important transportation assets going along the coast, which is Route 1 or Highway 1. And I think that we just have to, that's an example where we really have to get down to the details to see what the projections for sea level rise, what the scenarios for growth are going to happen. And then you compare that with the existing transportation infrastructure and really look out, 30 to 70 years to make sure we have a climate adapted transportation system. And I know a lot of folks are thinking about that, including Garth and others, on how we have a climate adapted coast. And in fact, the Nature Conservancy is just kicking off a project with Caltrans where we're looking at hotspots along the coast, and we're going to focus in Monterey County and look at Elkhorn Slough, which is exactly a place where it's a really important route. It's for both the economy of the area. It's a high value resource area, Elkhorn Slough, which has many values. It's also a place where you can look at natural infrastructure as a mechanism and means to absorb some of that sea level rise and not harden the coast. And so we're looking at that as a collaborative project. How can we work together where the solutions that come out of it help both the economy, help the environment, and help transportation? And I think we really have to get down to that. I think it's too late and too long to kind of close our eyes to the threats of sea level rise and other climate conditions coming forward. And Steve Heminger mentioned earlier that is one of the biggest threats in the Bay Area. And I think kudos to the Bay Area for really trying to tackle that head on, but there's a lot of other places along the coast where we can look at solutions that are not necessarily choices between green and gray, but how can we foster collaborative solutions?
Thank you. And really, really fantastic set of responses. I think we have just enough time here for a last bit of closing remarks maybe from each of you. So in 30 seconds to a minute, how would you wrap up the comments? Sarah?
So I would just like to emphasize that I think this updated process and through AB 441, we really have an opportunity to provide these key linkages between all of the health impacts that we've talked about today, the health and equity impacts, and how we can lift up what has been happening at the local level and really shine a light and show, how this is being done, how could we further improve it, and encourage us to build those relationships and those partnerships in order to do this in the right way, even if this means, going a little bit slower, but making sure that we do this right because it has the opportunity to set us on the future track.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to pause you right there because I think we actually did have one question. And so if you could hold.
Thank you so much. I just have observed some guidelines processes in the past, and I know that statute is a very important foundation under it. And I heard a lot of really good analysis and issues and things that were raised, and I heard feedback that these were very good, important issues. And I just wondered whether the statutory framework is there, in your opinion, to properly allow for what you would like to see in the guidelines for the plans.
Speak for my colleagues, although I suspect we would have a similar response. We think the statutory guidance is not sufficiently strong in a whole host of ways. We could probably spend a day, and I imagine everyone in this room has their own opinion of where that's true and not. So I won't get into the specifics in it, but would be happy to follow up offline. And I know we have partners in the room who are actually working specifically in that arena.
Other responses?
Part of the reason why we passed AB 441, it actually started out with putting health directly in the RTP guidelines, and over the course of that time got narrowed to having it be an appendix, which again I think is a good first step forward. But we wouldn't have, I think, brought that legislation forward if we didn't think that there was an important way to improve upon the current statute. So it's a small step, but I think there's other opportunities, as Shioni mentioned.
Great. We've been given a bit of a reprieve to go a few minutes over here. I think we've got one more question, maybe.
Hi, thank you for allowing this question. I really resonated with a lot of the comments up here on the panel today, and particularly about equity in transportation and access to the public participation process. The people in the most disadvantaged communities, you have the least amount of access to these processes, but they have the most to gain from it. And especially in smaller agencies or rural agencies that have less resources to do these planning processes and really reaching out to these people, I'm hoping that through this process that we can have some good advice and guidance in helping us navigate that public participation process and what the expectations are and how we might be able to engage and maybe even use new technologies to help us with that.
Great. Thank you.
Any thoughts on how we can do that?
Thoughts?
One of the things that we've found as a practice that we would love to see more people utilizing and continue to grow is where, going back again to partnership, where agencies are working in partnership with community-based groups that actually are working directly in communities with residents who are affected by our transportation systems, our housing choices, the way we plan our communities, et cetera. So there's a whole host of other ways that we would recommend we strengthen our process to engage communities in a meaningful way. But that is a model that we've seen some of the MPOs use that's had really positive effects and has helped shape and produce better plans in a whole host of ways.
And just to build on that, it's also a really good way to get input from community members who don't speak English very well, because oftentimes we understand that there's costs to translating materials and also providing interpretation services. And while it is required by law in some of the different areas, we understand it's a burden, but a lot of the community-based organizations have that capacity. And so it's a really great way to also connect with community. So I think partnerships with organizations who are already working with community members is a good way to build on that.
And just really quickly, I I think what both Sarah and Shioni said was great, so I don't feel like I have anything to add to that. But I think the one thing that I would say is that I can talk with you offline about this, but we, in our best practices project, one of the things that we did do was pull and look at like what are different COGs, different MPOs doing around public participation. I think one of the highlights that we kept hearing about was Fresno COG's program, where they did partner with, community-based organizations. They offered planning grants, they offered childcare. So there was a lot of things that they did that I think could maybe be a model, could serve as some inspiration. So happy to follow up with that offline too.
Great, thank you, Chanel. So back to closing thoughts, 30 seconds, Shioni.
So the one thing that we didn't get to spend as much time discussing, but has come up in a couple of the earlier panels, is really the importance of housing in this conversation, and the fact that housing and transportation can't be disconnected. Our housing crisis is only growing, and if we are thinking about building up around our transit centers, which is really the aspiration that we have, without also thinking about how we house the communities that already live there, the folks who are high propensity transit users, we're not going to fix our problems. We're going to push those people into places where they actually have less transit access, and where their ability to access the things that they need to thrive disappears. So housing and transportation really need to be taken head on together, and we think the SCS and RTP process need to do a better job with that.
Thank you. Liz?
I think the only thing I would mention is that it sounds like this panel and others are trying to load on new things, and I would agree that maybe we are. However, I think if we think of the end game, I think in the end it might actually be cheaper. And it might meet our economic goals, and it would meet our health goals, it would meet our conservation goals, our equity goals. And so both fiscally more palatable, but also for our economy, because we want to continue to provide those mechanisms for people to thrive. And I think we're on a really good path, but we have a long way to go.
Great. Thank you, Liz.
All right, 30 seconds. So there's two things that I wanted to bring up. I think one thing is that I feel very lucky to be on this panel, to be here speaking with you, but the reality is that for every one of me, there's like 10 other people who are chomping at the bit to weigh in on these. And so I am a little bit concerned, and I did want to share with the commission as well, and let you guys know that I am a little bit concerned about this really short timeline and really thinking about inclusive public participation. And so I think it's from like the federals, Secretary Fox's letters of opportunity, down to, I think we heard it this morning, transportation needs to have inclusive planning process. And so I'm concerned that if we try to cram this in so quickly, we're going to miss out on huge swaths of like California that want to, need to, and should be, I think, at this table weighing in. So that was kind of one point. And I think the other point was that, the next panel is really about economy, which I think is great, definitely in support of that. But I want to make sure that we think about economy not just as being how many cars or how many freight is moving, and thinking about it in terms of like monetizing, but thinking about the economic well-being of the people who are impacted by the economy, the people that are a part of the economy, that are moving, that are working, and that are, I think, impacted by the freight movement as well. And so those are kind of the pieces that I would share as the final thoughts.
Great, and thank you all again for your very thoughtful feedback, and hopefully this is the first of many, many discussions. A round of applause for the panel.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just, everybody, I want to just correct the record. Bus fare in San Diego is $2.25. Trolley fare is $2.50. I don't want to make it seem worse.
Yeah, definitely. This is very, very good. Very good.
All right, we're going to try for 1 minute to change our panels.
Thank you. So that is the current list. Tim Schott is replacing David.
Tim Schott is, and that is the current list. And so, and I've never met.
Just introduce me from GoBiz, from the Governor's Office of Business. Yeah, that's good. And I've been mainly.
You're the one doing it.
Yeah, I'm the one that's doing the transportation stuff. We have one person doing it in this one.
Get to know each other a little better because, but you do. It's really.
You know, I was here earlier. I told Garth that Panerai was going to make it. And he wanted me to sit up on the initial panel, but he said no, just sit in on the. I know. I wish I would have because I heard Fran, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm over here. Yeah. I don't know. I told him that she won't make it, that I'm here to fill in for her, and he says, well, just hold off and wait for the panel.
Because I actually went down and said, is Panerai, and then he said you were here, so I've been worried about it.
Yeah.
I'll clear that.
It's not a problem.
Yeah. No, you should have been here because we want to hear from you. It was kind of like on the recenter frequency, actually. We want to hear from you guys. We think that's just so important, especially on the guidelines. Just to get guidance on how far to push these plans. Great, do you know Richard Lyon?
Frank Ramirez, I'm with
GoBiz.
Richard
Lyon.
Hi, Richard.
Building Industry Association.
Panerai can't make today, so I'm sitting here in her stead.
Well,
Thank you for
well, great. There's my card just for your
Thank you.
files.
It's been so long. I know. Did you
Good to see you, Frank.
Tim,
how are you?
Excellent, thank you. I think those things are chaotic sometimes. Yeah. No, I think, no, you did a great job. I thought the speech was perfect.
All right, so we'll put you in the middle.
In what?
We have a few minutes or a minute?
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Okay. Just about, hopefully 5 minutes. All right, about 30 seconds and we're going to start. So if you can take your seats. Seconds. All right, this next panel is our last panel for today. It's panelists that we have here today. We're very pleased to have everyone here. This panel is representing the business and land use perspective, and the moderator for this panel is Frank Ramirez from the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Frank?
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here today, and I'm standing in place of Panerai Avdes, the director of GoBiz. She was called away on another matter and couldn't make it, so I'm hoping I'm up to par to do the task for her. I'd like to welcome the panelists, Commissioner, and as you all know, we've had some very exciting discussion on transportation. I do want to point out that our role here today with this panel is try to connect the transportation policies with economic development. So that's our role as a panel. And briefly, I'd like to introduce the panel. Tim Schott, the Executive Director of the California Association of Port Authorities. Rob Lapsley, President of the California Business Roundtable. Richard Lyon, Vice President of the Public Policy BIA. And Kiana Valentine, Legislative Representative of the California Association of Counties. Thank you and welcome. Appreciate your time. Moderators and other panels were asking you questions. That's not a part of the program. What I'm going to do is just get right into your 5-minute presentations. So, Rob, start with you. Oh, Kiana goes first. Okay.
Somehow I drew the short straw. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Kiana Valentine on behalf of the California State Association of Counties. I work on housing, land use, and transportation issues, so that's how I got selected to be part of this panel, and I'm very pleased to have been presented with this opportunity to talk about the local land use perspective as it relates to state and regional planning. I've sort of been struggling this week in trying to think of either thought-provoking or at the very least witty things to share with you all as we talk about land use, the economy, and prepare to update the Regional Transportation Planning Guidelines and the CTP Guidelines. And then it sort of dawned on me that I probably don't need to be too thought-provoking or witty. The two things most relevant and on my mind and before the legislature and administration, in fact, housing and transportation, are in fact relevant, very relevant to this conversation before us today. And then to top it all off, I walked in right before Commissioner Dunn made statements about needing to dive deeper and drill down from the regional transportation plans to the local level. You know, they are built from the ground up, but are we doing a good job bringing those regional plans back down to the local level? And it really, I think, captured the essence of the remarks I was hoping to make this afternoon. I want to talk about a couple of things I think pending before the legislature that are specifically relevant, again, to what is before us today. And I would like to start out by using the by right proposal, which I'm also pleased to take this opportunity to inform Commissioner Dunn and others that CSAC isn't actually opposed to by right. I cannot tell you we are in support of it at this very moment, but we are working with the administration and the legislature because we recognize the housing crisis has been prevalent for many, many decades, but it has really truly reached, I think, a new crisis level, and we want to be part of the solution. So part of the explanation as it comes to us from the Housing and Community Development Department as to why by right makes sense, and planning level review on a project level review of individual housing projects isn't necessary is the assumption that local planning efforts, general plans, area plans, specific plans are in fact up to date and capture all of the different goals that the state is trying to achieve from housing, transportation, and our climate goals. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. General plans are very old. And so as we're struggling to sort of figure out how best to implement by right, we are faced with a larger challenge of how California invests in planning at the local level. We talk a lot about state and regional planning, but I would like to lower the bar and talk about local planning efforts as well. And those same local general plans are, in fact, the foundation for the regional transportation plans and the sustainable community strategy. So those regional plans are only going to ever be as good as the local plans that they are founded on. So once again, as I sort of think about what we need to do as a state and a collective group of stakeholders and owners and operators of the transportation system, it's reinvest in local planning so we support from the ground up regional and state planning efforts. Pause for a second and catch my breath after all of my thoughts on housing. So to talk about let me talk about buy-in too. Commissioner Dunn, truly, you were like reading my mind today. I think it's so critical, thank you, that I know that city council members and county supervisors sit on the very regional boards that are overseeing the development of the RTPs and the SCSs. But I am unaware that it is happening necessarily at a sort of in a consistent manner statewide, that then those regional plans are being implemented through local land use decision making that really supports comprehensively those plans. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can collaborate more between locals and regions to support those goals. And my time's up. I didn't talk too much about transportation, but on that, my comments are primarily focused around funding, because I think we need to reinvest in the system to meet all of the goals that we've talked about on all the various panels. So with that, thank you.
Well, thank you, Kiana. Obviously, investments are very, very critical. It's great to put the ideas on the plan, but when you go to implementation, you need the funding to do it. Who drew the next shortest straw?
If I hit that, am I on?
I think yours is on.
Can you hear me now? All right. Hi, I'm Richard Lyon. I'm Senior Vice President for the California Building Industry Association. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We went through this about 6 years ago now, and it was quite an experience. I think the last round was pretty extensive because at that time we had to include and account for the new greenhouse gas reduction strategy that was passed by SB 375, the Sustainable Community Strategy, and include that into the update to the Regional Transportation Plan and advise the guidelines. Just by way of background, I represented the building industry, the CBIA, and the 375 discussions. I worked with the Air Resources Board and the Regional Target Advisory Committee as the targets were developed and set, and then I've worked with our local BIAs and our local builders as the SCSs have been developed and implemented over the last number of years. We very much believe in the program. We believe that Californians need mobility choice and options. Likewise, that choice extends to where people decide that they would like to live. So I think just from a general perspective, in order to make this program that is really kind of a first of its kind in California work, we need to have growth. It is absolutely critical that we have growth in order to meet the environmental challenges and meet the needs of our growing economy. And we need a transportation system that responds to the needs and it moves people and it moves goods. As to housing, obviously we have a housing supply and a housing shortage and affordability crisis in California. And one way to solve that problem is to simply build more housing. We need to do that. And we believe that it needs to be integrated appropriately with the transportation system. So I would say this as a general statement as to the guidelines. We think it should be easier this time to be able to put the guidelines together. We are guided by statutory requirements. We're guided by court decisions. We have the FAST Act that we need to account for. We have Assembly Bill 441 that talks about health and policies that we're statutorily required to account for. There are some other issues out there, but we aren't looking, at least from our perspective this time, of having to invent the wheel as it relates to SB 375 or the Sustainable Community Strategy. So we're hopeful that this time it'll be an easier go. We believe the time frame that's set out by the Commission is an appropriate time frame. Some of the things that we'll be looking at as we go forward, the SCS is set up to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets that are established by the board, the Air Resources Board. And it's important to keep that focus on priority on greenhouse gas. That in and of itself, I think, will be challenging enough to achieve. But what we think we should avoid, and this is going to require some caveats, but is diluting that effort by adding additional hard targets, as well-meaning as they may be. I know there's been discussions in the earlier panels about health and displacement and equity, and we think there's an appropriate place for those discussions, and there's an appropriate insertion into the guidelines as to how they inform transportation decisions going forward. But in terms of hard targets, we think that we need to avoid that. Probably the better place to address these issues is in the cost-benefit analysis that are done to analyze investments and transportation decisions. So we think as we talk about transportation, you're talking about emissions, you're talking about potential collisions, you're talking about safety and other issues. And that's where we believe it is appropriate to include those types of issues. I see that I'm getting the high sign. Let me hit a couple other things real quickly, and then I'll kick it over to Rob. As we move forward, it's important for us to be able to ground truth the assumptions on both housing and the modeling that go into the sustainable community strategies. Many of these assumptions are based upon the premise that that a certain percent of housing will be built in certain areas, and the modeling is premised on that as well. That isn't necessarily the outcomes that occur once the plans are put together. So we think there needs to be a healthy monitoring process that goes on that it ensures that the assumptions that are made that underline the scenarios with the SCS and the assumptions that go into the model are valid and that they actually produce results. We think there needs to be transparency in terms of those assumptions, so I'll just kind of let it go at that. And then finally, at least for purposes of this brief discussion, we need to be mindful about the whole notion of leakage. And I talk about leakage in a much broader sense. By that I mean the downside that we face in this state if we don't adequately fund both the repair and replacement of our transportation needs and take steps that we need to take to make improvements to relieve congestion, to relieve bottlenecks, and to provide the capacity for a growing California going forward, as well as the housing. If we don't do that, then there's going to be a massive leakage from California, and that is not good for our state, it's not good for our economy, and with that, I'll stop and turn it over to others.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I wanted to see if maybe I could take a few minutes and go in a little bit different direction, maybe even a little bit different context. First off, the ability of the commission to be able to undertake a task, what I would call a monumental task like this at this point, given all of the stakeholders involved, but most importantly, given the stakes of what is involved for not just California's economy, but really California's quality of life, because that's really what transportation now represents, and how we're going to be able to create our communities, entice employers, grow jobs, but when we are not working, to be able to have the recreation and to be able to have the ability to move our loved ones, our families, our kids around in a way that makes us all want to stay here. That's really, to me, what all of this process represents. So if I could, I want to highlight one key part of where we believe some of these pieces are going to connect. At stake in California's economy, yes, we've grown back 2 million jobs. GoBiz has been working hard, and we appreciate their efforts. Hopefully Panarea right now is out meeting with companies and locking down more that are coming here. We all want that, and we all need that. But on those 2 million jobs, 55% of them were grown in the Bay Area. And what we have found since the recession in California is that our economy has changed. We actually are growing high-paying jobs, low-paying jobs, and we're losing structural middle-class jobs that were particularly represented by the manufacturing sector. So we've lost over 600,000 jobs in manufacturing. And when we consider California's overall population, when we consider those who particularly are not going to college, but have to have career paths, middle-class lives, provide for their families, what we are seeing in this transformation is that a lot of the middle-class jobs are coming back through trade, and they're particularly coming back through sectors like warehousing. And so we're seeing displacement, but we're seeing growth at the same time. But when it comes to being able to maintain or grow this new middle-class sector of warehousing, we have over 500,000 jobs now in California in just this one sector. The wages are growing. But we have to have a transportation sector that is going to facilitate goods movement, freight movement, and really be creative in connecting the dots on things like a great sustainable freight strategy. If we don't encompass those pieces among all the stakeholders to be able to do things in a creative way, then we're going to suffer as a state, suffer as an economy, and most importantly, suffer in our quality of life. And that takes all of us to be able to step outside our normal ways of doing business, if you will. Everyone is fiercely committed, and I have the greatest respect for this, in being able to see improvement in all of their specific areas, but it takes compromise and it takes the ability to look at things in a different way. So I'm going to ask that in this process, business has its responsibility to bring the information to the table. Housing is key, that you've heard today, but let's work together to hit key points where we can do things differently and connect the dots and be creative and truly get a transportation plan that reflects the future of California, that's funded, that gets reforms, but that does things in a truly creative way. Because without that, we are not going to have the jobs here, and we are not going to be able to have the kind of society that we want. Thank you.
Tim?
Do I have to push a button? Thank you. Pardon me. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for having me today. Greatly appreciate the opportunity. My name is Tim Schott, and I'm the Executive Director of the California Association of Port Authorities, which is comprised of the state's 11 publicly owned ports. Through education and advocacy, our association promotes policy priorities related to trade and goods movement. And of late, those efforts have been largely focused on increasing competitiveness, improving freight infrastructure and operational efficiencies, and in developing innovative environmental quality and energy programs. California is home to the most productive system of ports in the nation. We've got 3 of the largest container ports in the country and a diverse system of niche ports that spread from along the coast from San Diego to Humboldt and on the inland waterways in West Sacramento and Stockton. And together, those ports serve as the gateways for our freight system. A freight system that's responsible for 1/3 of the state's economy and jobs, with freight-dependent industries accounting for over $700 billion in revenue and more than 5 million jobs. So a critical component of the economy. And as Rob said, a critical component for living wage, middle-class jobs that don't require a college degree or an advanced degree. It's a pathway forward to the middle class for a whole class of our citizens that are least advantaged, if you will. Our port authorities are public entities, and they develop the lands that they manage, many of them on behalf of the state of California. And then they lease those properties to private companies that largely handle terminal operations. And all of California's public ports are true enterprise districts. So they frankly they don't rely on tax revenue. They rely on their operating and business revenue, and they eat what they kill. And we're in a very highly competitive environment in terms of what could be killed these days. So our ports are not only critical economic engines, at the same time, they're leading the nation and indeed the world in developing environmentally friendly port operations. And we're very, very proud of our roles as environmental stewards and of the tremendous air quality improvements that the freight industry has achieved over the last decade. Since 2005, our largest facilities report emissions reductions on the order of 80% in particulate matter, 90% in SOx, and 50% in NOx, and significant greenhouse gas reductions to, I think, somewhere around 25%. Good local, regional, and statewide, and even national transportation planning is critical to the operation of our ports and to California's broader freight system. And until fairly recently, freight was largely an afterthought in planning processes. Fairly recently, going back a decade or so, been doing this a long time, so I guess it depends on your definition of recently. But Proposition 1B was a critical element, we think, in the development of a freight awareness in California. Many of us worked long and hard to assure that there was significant funding, $2 billion in freight-related infrastructure funding, and another $1 billion in freight-related air quality improvements that were included in the bond package. And that program, I think if I have it right, leveraged about $7 billion or more than $7 billion in investments in the system. And frankly, when you're talking about that kind of money, folks take notice of freight. And we're pleased that it happened and pleased that, frankly, freight became a larger piece of the planning puzzle. Today, our relationships, the relationships between our member ports and the local and regional planners are really very good. And we coordinate regularly with our regional MPOs and with many of our planning entities. Our ports serve on committees and serve on policy guideline groups, thank you, sir. And they supply data that's critical, including estimates and projections for cargo, trucks, trains, and the like. We believe that the regional process should continue largely as it is, in the sense that we should be continuing to look at a bottoms-up approach, where regional projects and regional priorities have the opportunity to be examined at the regional level without undue state burden in terms of planning processes or delivery of projects. On the state planning level, we've been very involved with the Sustainable Freight Action Plan that Rob mentioned, and we appreciate all of the agencies that have been involved in that and their significant outreach to make sure we've got a lot of stakeholders, all of the stakeholders involved. But we think on the state level, there are a number of things that should be continued to be pursued. And the first would be the recognition that we need a dedicated funding source for freight infrastructure investment, and we need to improve our competitiveness at the same time that we transition to zero and near zero emissions. The last round of air quality improvements ran a total of about $5 billion in California-only costs. And this next round is going to be significantly more expensive, or likely to be significantly more expensive, in that we have picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And the next round of air quality improvements are going to take significant technological advancement and implementation. And that's where we need the state. We need the state and the state planning level to fund infrastructure improvements that can help us mitigate the California-only costs and retain our customers and the goods that move through the state and provide our jobs. And we need the state to be a leader in the development of the technologies and assuring that those technologies are not only commercially viable, but commercially available as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Variety of good issues that were raised. In lieu of the time that we have, I'd like to ask the commissioners if you have any questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate your comments, and I am always touched because you're the harbingers of understanding fundamentally in many, many ways the economy of the state of California. When you have an economy that is the 6th largest in the world, where we stand between the United Kingdom and France, if we were our own country, it's pretty astounding. But the fundamentals, as you raise, because you guys also see into the future, and the fundamentals are at risk here. Clearly, when I read a study recently where of the top 10 areas in the nation where millennials are fleeing, Orange County is number 2 after Silver Spring, Maryland, and the rest of the top 6 are all in California. So the fundamentals, growing middle-class jobs, critically important. I love that you raised that, and we have to be aware of that. This is a planning exercise, I get that, but you've already seen us at CTC either defer or delete $1.5 billion of statewide projects because we're out of dough. And there's no deal, there's no revenue, there's no reforms. So looking at you as great state leaders, and we're trying to pressure folks into doing the right thing, obviously we need a solution somehow. You as state leaders looking at the pressure that's going to be put on locals to develop funding sources, because when government doesn't do the right thing at the state or the federal level, the locals will think of a way. I'm interested in any thoughts as state leaders you might have on how we help our locals develop funding mechanisms to ultimately end up implementing this plan. Now, that's a 3-hour discussion, but something to think about in future things is if this plan has to get implemented, it can't get implemented without funding, and we're sitting at a real tough time right now. But I love your comments because it got me thinking in terms of where are the paths to solutions. So thank you.
First answer anyway. Great question, Commissioner. One of the things that our port authorities focus on is the need to attract private investment.
Yes.
And our ports are, frankly, a perfect model of public-private partnership. We're public agencies. We develop, maintain, and improve facilities that are then leased to the private sector. We've got skin in the game. They've got skin in the game. The dilemma that our port authorities face is that there is a limit to how much investment folks will make before they too decide to go to another state. And about half of the cargo that's coming into this state is what's called discretionary. It's not staying in California, it's going east on rail. And that cargo could go through any number of ports in the country or Mexico and Canada. And with the widened Panama Canal, which just opened on Sunday, we're yet to see whether that will have a significant impact, but it could. And whether it does or not, we know that we've been losing market share over the last number of years. And so we're intent on trying to continue our conversations with our private sector stakeholders in a long supply chain. And those conversations have to include local community organizations and all of the environmental and environmental justice advocates as well.
Can I add one thing onto that, Commissioner? So it's interesting that in this recent primary election in June 7th, there were almost 150 local measures on the ballot for new taxes to be able to take care of a variety of obviously local community needs, and almost every one of them passed. 143 passed. People recognize that if obviously they can see the problem, that they're willing to step up and help solve the need. I think the problem now exists in Sacramento, which is truly the need for the local solution, in that we have got to come together to be able to help support our local leaders to put more pressure back on the state representatives to get a state funding solution. And it looks like if it doesn't come in August and it's not coming in November, then it better come in January or February, or else obviously all of this is wasted. So there's, I think, going to be a big outreach effort to try and increase that dialogue, but without a doubt that this thing has to get finished in order to meet that local need.
In order to move along, Commissioner, do you have any additional questions?
Just a thank you to the panelists. You know, I said earlier, I think the California economy is the envy of the world, and I really believe, I think that is true. We have our challenges, and the lack of transportation funding is certainly one of them. But we shouldn't forget that we have incredible benefits to offer Californians and all the people that are still coming here. The growth that we see in the innovation economy in San Diego and Silicon Valley and other places, those are young people that are coming to California from all over the world and all over the United States to do new work and build new apps and all these other things that we're putting out across the globe. So we have our challenges. Every panel today has talked about the complexities that we're facing. And all the different elements that it's going to take to really pull a complex response to the needs of California together. But that's our job. That's why we're here. And some of us have been doing it for many, many years, and we're going to continue to do it. And I think there are solutions in front of us, not that they're easy or simple, but that I believe we can get them done. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Sounds like we're all in very capable hands. There is a question that was submitted electronically that we have to take.
Yes, the question's from Michael Schwartz from SFCTA. It's directed at Mr. Lyon, but whoever would like to answer it. Mr. Lyon, what particular concerns do you have regarding the modeling of how the modeling represents land use and biases that may be embedded? And more generally, what problem were you referring to, and or can you give a specific example of what issue around land use and modeling in the SCS?
Well, that's Michael, is that his name? That's a good question. And let me kind of then paint a scenario. Let's assume that your SCS says that a certain percentage of future development, let's say 75%, will occur in specifically defined places within a region. That's the assumption you make. Then let's say you plug that assumption into a model, and the model comes back and it goes, yikes. Based upon demographics, based upon market conditions, based upon economics, this is not likely to occur. So you've got one of two things you can do. You can adjust your assumption to be more realistic, or you can view the model output as flawed. And then you can say, well, that's got to be corrected in some way. So if you correct that assumption then by assuming that certain transportation-related improvements that are made will produce a certain type of an outcome and correct the original output of the model, then you risk getting an outcome that you may desire, but it in fact is artificial. So what I've just described to you is not a theoretical situation, it's actually occurred out there. So that's what I mean by ground truthing the assumptions on housing. That's an example that goes into the SCS, and ensuring that there's transparency in the assumptions that go into the modeling, so that it can be viewed and reviewed by everybody for reality.
Thank you for that answer. I'm being told that we're out of time. And if you would like each of you to give a quick closing 30-second statement, that would be ideal. There's one.
Ditto.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for each one of you.
We are running a little behind on schedule, so we'll move right ahead. Our next speaker is Coco Persino. She serves as a Deputy Director for Planning and Modal Programs at Caltrans. And I'll turn it over to Coco. Are you ready? Okay.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try to get through this really fast in the interest of time. It's actually a pleasure for me to be here to talk a little bit about and help launch these very dynamic and sort of forward-thinking updates to the Regional Transportation Plan Guidelines and then the first ever California Transportation Plan Guidelines. So a lot of the material has been covered, so what I'm going to do in the interest of time is run through some of the slides relatively quickly, but what we wanted to do was to make sure that they were available, since some of the people that may not be able to be here today might be able to refer to the slides. So let me start with a little bit of history and background on the RTPs, and these have been talked a lot about throughout the day. So this slide just talks about what the purpose of the regional transportation plans are. So for the purpose of today, I really just want to kind of update that really what we're focusing on is getting a product out that is an iterative process. So the idea is to get through all the stakeholders and all of the different folks that are here today, those that are viewing on the web, and those that aren't here today, is to get everybody involved in a process where we can develop guidelines that are really representative of some of the recent changes that we need to address. Now, the last time, we talked a little bit earlier in the day, the last time that the RTP guidelines were updated really was in 2010. And that was a pretty extensive update that we've already heard about a little bit. One of the things that worked extremely well during that update process was the use of work groups. And the plan is to do something very similar with both the update to the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines as well as what goes before the first California Transportation Plan guidelines. Now, we weren't just sitting around, we were actually looking at a lot of the different work that's been done in the regional transportation plans. There was a request by the California Transportation Commission that Caltrans review the MPO regional transportation plans and come up with some recommendations and some findings. This report was actually prepared last year and actually was talked about at the last commission meeting. But there were 14 recommendations, and some of those recommendations you'll be able to see hopefully in the next iteration of the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines. For example, one of the recommendations that came out was that there be separate guidelines for MPOs and for regional transportation planning agencies. So our idea was to use this report as a tool that all of us can look at to help inform the update of the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines. Now, this section I'm going to go through relatively quickly. It really just talks about some of the federal requirements related to regional transportation planning and what needs to go into regional transportation plans. And I think Tanisha, who was here earlier, talked about the need, especially with the federal planning rule and the MAP 21 performance measures and target setting process, to really pay attention to some of those requirements and make sure that we include them in the next iteration. Then on the state side, you can actually see what some of the components are in terms of the rules and regulations that sort of set some boundaries and expectations regarding what needs to go into the regional transportation plan from a state perspective. This is a slide that's intended to do a bit of a comparison regarding the Regional Transportation Plan and the California Transportation Plan. I think the real emphasis that I want to really talk about or emphasize here is, as we learned earlier and we talked about earlier, is there is this really strong relationship between the Regional Transportation Planning process as well as the statewide transportation planning process. And what it really means is, at the end of the day, is why is it that we're doing this? I think really it's a planning framework, a regional and a state planning framework that's intended to complement what we need as at state level. And at the end of the day, what we're all looking for is just better communities, a better quality of life, and a transportation system that helps deliver on that. So what we're trying to do between the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines and the California Transportation Plan guidelines is to really set up that framework that enables us to sort of have that flexibility and make those kinds of decisions. Now I'm going to shift a little bit into the California Transportation Plan guidelines process. So it was talked about earlier in the opening, this is the first time that we'll actually have California Transportation Plan guidelines. And these are some ideas regarding them. Here's a little bit about the state legislation. So you can see that there's a lot that's been going on at the state level in terms of key legislation that's been introduced, as well as executive orders that have been executed that need to be factored into a statewide vision for transportation. Here's a little bit about some of the major requirements of California Transportation Plan from the federal side. Likewise, here's the same from a state side. I think just in summary, when it comes to the CTP guidelines, what we were talking about earlier is that we really want to use this work group process that we used for the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines. There's been a couple of new updates, as I mentioned earlier, that we want to make sure that we incorporate. One of the things that I said earlier worked really well was the process itself. For those of us that were involved in the last iteration of the update of the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines, There's a lot of complexity that goes into these, and sometimes the devil is in the details, but the process does in fact work. This iterative process, this collaborative process does in fact work, and I think we saw that in the last iteration. So we're hoping to do the exact same thing for a new version of California Transportation Plan Guidelines. So with that, I went through these really fast in the interest of time, so I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
All right, we're nearing the end of this meeting. I appreciate that we're ending this, Coco and myself sitting here together, because this is a joint process that we're undergoing. The California Transportation Commission ultimately adopts the guidelines, but the development process is really, Caltrans, the expertise, the planning expertise, and the level of resources required to really develop these guidelines and work with all the stakeholders. It resides at Caltrans, and for that we're greatly appreciative to Coco and her staff. And but moving forward, just wanted to let you know on our end at the Commission, this effort at the Commission will be facilitated by Commission staff, and I would actually like Garth Hopkins, he's the Deputy Director for the California Transportation Commission for Planning, to please stand up so everybody can see him, and I'm sure you all know who he is. And then we have, I just want to show you the staff involved in this effort. Laura Pennybaker and Jose Oseguera are both also assisting in this effort. And just for this purposes of this meeting, since we're talking about staff, I'd like to thank those three individuals, but also Doug Remedios over here and Christina Sori. So, all right, thank you. I guess, I just mentioned that the process to develop these guidelines or amend the RTP guidelines, develop the CTP guidelines is, really something that we're working together with Caltrans on. Caltrans will ultimately be handling the majority of the effort. But we do have a timeline that we have developed in coordination with Caltrans. And this timeline, though, I need to let you know that it is a timeline. It is consistent with the Commission's expectations for the time frame in which we need to have the Commission adopt the guidelines. So at this point, we are planning to bring forward the final guidelines, final draft, to the Commission at the December meeting for consideration of adoption. This time frame is the same time frame that we utilize to develop and adopt the Regional Transportation Plan guideline amendments in response to Senate Bill 375. So it is a timeline that we believe is a reasonable time frame, and it is a time frame necessary to actually inform the regional transportation plans and the California Transportation Plan that are already under development at this point in time. So there are key dates that are up here, and just to go over these dates with you briefly at a high level, Caltrans has committed to releasing a first draft of both the Regional Transportation Plan guideline amendments and the California Transportation Plan guidelines. So this is a first draft. It will be posted next week. And we are planning to hold work group meetings July 13th and 14th. And then we will continue to hold these work group meetings, and I'll get into what these work groups are, but hold those through July, August, into September if necessary. And these work groups are open to everyone, all stakeholders. Based on the input received, Caltrans will release a revised draft for comment in September. And then we'll see where we're at, but the plan is that the final guidelines, the final drafts would be put together in November for bringing forward to the Commission in December. The Commission is required to hold 2 hearings, one in the north, one in the south, and so we may utilize the December and January meetings for that.
And if I can just sort of add something, Susan, in the version that's going to come out in July, Please keep in mind that that's sort of like the first iteration, and it's really just an intent to at least try to acknowledge those state statutes and federal changes that we are aware of that need to be incorporated. But we're looking for the work group process, input from all of you to sort of capture the other things that need to be included in those guidelines.
Yeah, thank you, Coco. And you know, we will put up a web link for you, but as soon as, you know, these drafts are posted, the comments can start coming in. So you don't need to wait for a work group meeting or any of that. Comments are fluid. So wanted to let you know that both Caltrans and the CTC will have a dedicated web page to this effort. We will be posting information as we know it. And the keeper of the latest drafts is Caltrans, so that will be on their website. And the comments that you will be submitting will be going to Caltrans. It is, you know, we just want to reiterate that it is extremely important to both the Commission and Caltrans that we receive input from all interested stakeholders and affected stakeholders. And so where you are in your positions representing others, if you feel that the word isn't sufficiently getting to those that you represent, please let us know. The work groups that, I don't know if there's a slide for the work groups. There is. Thanks, Coco. Thank you. Okay, the work groups that we are planning to form are, we want a work group on public health, active transportation, a work group on modeling, another on sustainable community strategies, another on environmental climate change, adaptation, air quality, freight, and then performance measures. And you know, we're pulling in the federal and state requirements because, you know, much of that with the FAST Act will be centered around discussions on performance measures. These work groups are really for purposes of, these are the areas that we're expecting to have, there's going to be more interest and more comments that are brought forth. And so these are the work groups that we would form to really have those open dialogues and robust discussions. They will be, right now, the work groups scheduled are in Sacramento, but we will have a teleconference option to call in. And if you're not participating on these work groups, but you have an interest, the meeting minutes will be kept and posted, and you can submit your comments to us online. So the first work group meetings are, let's see. I changed it. Oh, thank you. The first work group meetings are scheduled for July 13th and 14th. They will be in Sacramento. There's the links are on the website and on the slide. And so if you send in an email and let us know that you're interested in participating in one or all, however many you want to participate, let us know, and we'll make sure that we keep you informed of what's going on with that in that regard. Again, just to reiterate, the work groups will be facilitated by Caltrans. These meetings are expected to run as productively as possible. You know, we would ask that you come prepared with proposed language that you believe should be incorporated as an amendment in either the CTP guidelines or the RTP guidelines, depending on which work group you're in. And, you know, to make these meetings run efficiently, it is very important that you come prepared. And so again, if you're interested in participating, please let us know and sign up. And there's another slide. This is a slide with key contact information. Again, this will be on both Caltrans and CTC's website. You can contact the individuals, any of these individuals on the slide, to receive additional information. And then I know that we've lost our majority of our moderators and panelists, but I just really want to thank them all for their participation today. I believe it was, we were honored to have the presenters that we had today. We had very high-level officials sharing their perspectives, and their perspectives will serve as a foundation for us, and I hope all of you, in moving forward and developing the amendments that we need to make. I'd also like to thank Caltrans in advance for their efforts, not only in advance for their prior work in preparing amendments. They're going to be coming out with 2 draft documents, maybe 3, next week. Caltrans prepared a evaluation of the RTPs that have been adopted, to date against the existing RTP guidelines. They've done a lot of work so far, and they're embarking on a huge endeavor. And so with that respect, I'd like to thank Coco Briseno, Katie Benoit, I don't know if she's here.
She's right
Katie.
there.
Okay, she's the Division Chief of Planning. And also there's a few other staff members, I don't know if they're here. Reza Navai, Erin Thompson, I think I see her. Chris Radican, Gabe Corley, Lene Van Valen, Priscilla Martinez-Velez, and Kelly Egan. And I would also like to extend a great thank you to Gino and Ed for always helping the commission in all of our meetings. Just tremendous thank you. And lastly, on behalf of the commission, I want to thank you all for being here today and for your interest in this and for helping us ensure that we have a transparent, inclusive process moving forward. So thank you so much.